There are moments in history that don't just confuse us, they disturb us, not because we don't have answers, but because the deeper we look, the less sense things make. Across centuries, people have vanished without a trace. Entire events have unfolded with no clear explanation. Objects have appeared where they shouldn't exist, and stories documented, recorded, witnessed continue to challenge everything we think we understand about reality. And here's the unsettling part. These aren't myths. They aren't just stories passed down through rumor. Many of them are real cases, investigated, debated, reopened again and again with no final answer. So what do you do when history leaves behind questions instead of conclusions? Do you accept the most logical explanation? Or do you consider that something else might be at play? For the next few hours, we're going to explore some of the strangest, most unsettling mysteries ever recorded. No exaggeration, no fiction, just cases that refuse to be solved. So take a moment, get comfortable, and ask yourself one simple question. How much of the world do we actually understand? Because once you step into these stories, you might not look at history the same way again. The princes who disappeared without a trace. The Tower of London has stood for nearly 1,000 years, cold, silent, unmoving. Its thick stone walls have seen executions, imprisonments, betrayals, and secrets so dark they were never meant to leave. But among all the stories that echo through its corridors, one stands above the rest. Not because we know what happened, but because we don't. In the summer of 1483, two boys walked into the Tower of London, and they were never seen again. A kingdom in chaos. To understand this mystery, you have to step into England at a time when power was fragile, and loyalty meant very little. The country had just lost its King Ive. His death was sudden, unexpected, and it left behind a dangerous problem. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old, too young to rule, too vulnerable to survive alone. So control of the kingdom fell into the hands of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man who, on the surface, appeared loyal, protective, even necessary. He was appointed Lord Protector, the guardian of the young king until he was old enough to rule. But history has a way of hiding its intentions, and sometimes protection is just another word for control. The Last Journey. In April 1483, young Edward V began his journey to London. He was meant to be crowned king, a moment that should have marked the beginning of his reign. Instead, it marked the beginning of his disappearance. Along the way, Richard intercepted him, not with violence, not with force, but with authority. Edward was taken into his uncle's care and brought to the Tower of London. At the time, this wasn't unusual. The Tower wasn't just a prison, it was also a royal residence. Kings stayed there before coronations. It was considered safe. Shortly after, Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, joined him. Two princes, alone. Inside one of the most secure and most feared structures in England. At first, everything seemed normal. They were seen playing in the gardens, walking together, appearing, at least on the surface, unharmed. But slowly, something changed. The silence begins. As weeks passed, sightings became less frequent. The boys appeared less often. Then, rarely. And then, not at all. No announcement, no explanation, no official record of their deaths. Just silence. A silence that has lasted for more than 500 years. Theories that refuse to die. When something disappears without explanation, people begin to fill in the gaps. And in this case, the theories are as chilling as the mystery itself. Theory 1. A calculated murder. The most widely accepted theory is also the darkest. That Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later crowned King Richard I, ordered the deaths of his nephews. The motive seems clear. With the princes gone, there would be no one left to challenge his claim to the throne. No rivals, no threats, just power. And history hasn't been kind to Richard. Writers, including Shakespeare, painted him as ruthless, ambitious, a man willing to do anything to become king, including murder. But here's the problem. There's no proof, no bodies confirmed, no direct evidence linking him to the crime, just suspicion. and a story that feels too convenient. Theory 2. A different conspiracy. Some historians argue that Richard may not have been responsible at all. Instead, they point to others who had just as much to gain: political rivals, foreign powers, even members of the royal court. Because in a time like this, power didn't belong to one person, it was a game, and removing the princes could have benefited many players. Could someone else have orchestrated their disappearance? Someone working in the shadows, while history blamed the obvious suspect? Theory 3. A quiet, hidden death. Another theory is far less dramatic but equally unsettling: that the princes were never murdered. At least not intentionally. Instead, they may have died from illness, neglect, or poor conditions. And rather than reveal the truth, those responsible chose to hide it, quietly removing the bodies, erasing the evidence, turning a tragic accident into a permanent mystery. Theory 4. They survived. And then there's the most intriguing possibility of all: that the princes didn't die, that they were secretly moved, hidden away, perhaps even sent abroad under new identities. There have been claims over the centuries of individuals who said they were one of the lost princes. Most were dismissed. But the fact that these claims exist at all raises a question. If they died, why was there never proof? The discovery that changed nothing in 1674, nearly 200 years later, something unexpected was found. Workers inside the tower uncovered bones, 2 small skeletons, buried beneath a staircase. For many, this was it. The mystery solved. The remains of the lost princes. But even then, doubt remained. The bones were examined, studied, but never definitively identified. No modern DNA testing has confirmed their identity. And some believe the bones were placed there later. A staged discovery, an attempt to close a story that refused to end, a mystery that still lives today. The Tower of London still stands. Tourists walk through its halls. Guides tell its stories. And somewhere within those ancient walls, the question still lingers. What really happened to the princes? Were they victims of ambition, casualties of a broken system, or part of a story we still don't fully understand? Because sometimes the most disturbing mysteries aren't the ones with terrifying answers, they're the ones with none at all. And as time continues to move forward, this story remains frozen, unanswered, unresolved, waiting. In the early 1600s, deep in the quiet countryside of France, there was a small town that no one expected to remember. A place where life moved slowly, where faith guided everything, and where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Until something did, and once it began, it refused to stop. The town was Loudun, and what happened there would leave people questioning not just religion, but reality itself. At first it was small, easy to ignore: a few strange behaviors inside a convent, whispers among the nuns, moments of unease. But no one thought much of it, because convents were places of discipline, silence, and strict routine. The women who lived there had dedicated their lives to faith. They followed rules, they obeyed authority, and they did not lose control. But then the changes became harder to dismiss. One of the nuns began to act strangely. She claimed she was being watched, not by a person, but by something unseen. At night, she said she could feel a presence, close, breathing, waiting. Soon, others began to report the same thing. At first, people assumed it was fear or imagination. But fear has a way of spreading, and in Loudun, it spread fast. Within weeks, the convent was no longer quiet. It was chaotic. The nuns began screaming, convulsing, speaking in voices that didn't sound like their own. Some claimed they could see figures no one else could see. Others spoke words and languages they had never learned, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. Their strength became impossible to control. And the most disturbing part? They all described something similar. They weren't alone. News traveled quickly. People gathered outside the convent. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors turned into fear, and fear turned into belief. Something was wrong. Something unnatural. Something evil. The church was called in, and when they arrived, they didn't hesitate. They had seen things like this before, or at least they believed they had. Their conclusion was immediate. Possession. The nuns, they said, were not sick. They were not imagining things. They were under the control of something far darker, something that had entered their bodies, something that had entered their bodies, something that needed to be forced out. And so, the exorcisms began. One by one, the nuns were brought forward, prayers were spoken, rituals performed, commands shouted into the air as if something invisible was listening. At times, the nuns would respond, but not as themselves. They spoke in deep, distorted voices, mocking, laughing, arguing with the priests, sometimes even revealing secrets no one believed they could know. The sessions lasted for hours, sometimes days, and yet nothing changed. If anything, it got worse. As the events continued, one name began to appear again and again. A man who, according to the nuns, was responsible for everything. Urbain Grandier. Grandier was a priest, but not a typical one. He was known for being intelligent, charismatic, confident. Too confident, some would say. He had made enemies within the church, not because he lacked faith, but because he challenged authority. He spoke openly, criticized those in power, and lived in a way that didn't always match expectations. There were rumors about him, relationships he shouldn't have had, choices he shouldn't have made. But rumors alone don't destroy a man. Accusations do. The nuns claimed that Grandier had made a pact, that he had summoned something, that he had sent it to the convent, to possess them, to control them, to turn their faith into fear. And in a time like this, that was enough. Grandier was arrested, not quietly, not carefully, but publicly, because by now, Loudon wasn't just dealing with fear, it was dealing with hysteria. People wanted answers, and more importantly, they wanted someone to blame. The trial began quickly, but from the start, something felt off. The evidence wasn't physical. There were no witnesses to any crime, no proof of dark rituals, no confirmed acts of witchcraft, only testimonies from the nuns, from those already convinced something supernatural was happening. And yet, that was enough. During the trial, the nuns were brought forward again, but this time not for exorcism, for accusation. They described visions, encounters, moments where Grandier appeared to them in forms that didn't seem human. They claimed he controlled the entities inside them, that he had power beyond understanding. The more they spoke, the more people believed, because fear doesn't need evidence. It just needs a story. Grandier denied everything, from the beginning to the end. He claimed he was innocent, that the accusations were false, that he was being targeted. But in a situation like this, truth becomes secondary, because once people believe something, it becomes almost impossible to change their minds. The decision was made, not slowly, not carefully, but quickly. Grandier was found guilty. The punishment was severe, public, final. He was to be executed, burned alive. On the day of his execution, crowds gathered, some out of belief, others out of curiosity, and some simply because they didn't want to be the ones who doubted. Grandier was brought forward, still claiming innocence, still denying everything, even in his final moments. And then it was over. But here's where the story becomes even more unsettling. Because his death didn't end anything. The possessions continued, the nuns still screamed, still convulsed, still claimed they were not in control. The rituals continued, the fear remained, and the questions only grew louder. If Grandier was responsible, why didn't it stop? If he was guilty, why did nothing change? Some began to doubt, quietly, carefully, because questioning something like this was dangerous. But the doubts were there. What if it wasn't possession? What if it was something else? One explanation points to psychology, mass hysteria, a condition where groups of people begin to share the same symptoms, the same fears, the same experiences, not because something external is controlling them, but because their environment is. The pressure, the isolation, the strict rules of convent life. All of it building over time. until something breaks. Another theory suggests manipulation, that the nuns were influenced, guided, pushed into their behavior by authority figures, by expectations, by the belief that something had to be wrong, and once that belief was accepted, everything else followed. And then, there's the possibility that no one wants to fully consider, that something unexplained actually happened, not possession in the way it was described, but something still unknown, something that affected multiple people at the same time, in ways we still don't understand. Even today, historians argue over Laodoon. Some say it was one of the clearest examples of hysteria in history. Others believe it was a calculated political move, a way to remove a man who had become inconvenient, and some still aren't sure, because the details don't fully align. The behavior doesn't fully make sense, and the outcome doesn't fully resolve anything. What happened inside that convent? Why did it begin? Why did it continue? And why did it only end when people stopped looking? Loudon is quiet now, just like it was before. The buildings still stand, the streets remain unchanged, but the story has never really gone away, because sometimes the most unsettling mysteries aren't about what we see. They're about what people believe they saw, and how far those beliefs can go once they take control. The colony that disappeared before history could remember it. In the early 1600s, when the idea of crossing the ocean still felt like stepping into the unknown, a group of English settlers arrived on the harsh northern coast of what is now Maine, driven by ambition, curiosity, and the promise of a new beginning. They came not as wanderers but as planners, backed by investors, equipped with tools and determined to build something permanent in a land that had already proven unforgiving to those who underestimated it. This settlement would later be known as the Pulpham Colony, though unlike its more famous counterpart at Roanoke, its story would not be remembered through mystery alone, but through something quieter and in many ways more unsettling. A failure so sudden, so complete, that it almost erased itself from history. At first, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The settlers arrived in 1607, the same year Jamestown was founded further south, and began constructing their outpost along the Kennebec River. They built a fortified structure, organized their supplies, and even established early contact with the local Wabanaki people. For a brief moment, it appeared that this colony might succeed where others had struggled. There was structure, leadership, and a clear sense of purpose. But survival in this new world was never just about preparation. It was about adaptation, and that was something no expedition could fully plan for. As the months passed, small problems began to surface. The climate was harsher than expected, the winters colder, longer, and far less forgiving than anything the settlers had experienced in England. Food supplies, carefully rationed at first, began to dwindle faster than anticipated. Hunting and fishing proved difficult, not because the land lacked resources, but because the settlers lacked the knowledge to use them effectively. The environment wasn't just unfamiliar, it was actively resistant. Every attempt to impose order on it seemed to fail in ways they couldn't predict. But the challenges weren't just environmental. Internally, the colony began to fracture. Leadership, which had initially provided stability, became uncertain after the sudden death of George Popham, the colony's president. Without him, authority weakened. Decisions became less coordinated. Confidence began to slip, and in a place where survival depended on unity, even small divisions could become dangerous. What had started as a structured effort slowly began to feel unstable, as if the entire colony was losing its direction. Relations with the Wabanaki people also became more complicated over time. Early interactions had been relatively peaceful, even cooperative in some instances, but as resources became scarce and tensions rose, misunderstandings began to grow. There is no clear record of a major conflict, no definitive account of violence that forced the settlers out, but the absence of clear documentation only adds to the uncertainty. Something shifted, something changed, and whatever it was, it made survival feel less possible with each passing day. By the winter of 1608, conditions had deteriorated significantly. The cold was relentless, food was limited, morale was low, and, perhaps most importantly, the sense of purpose that had brought them there in the first place was beginning to fade. The settlers were no longer building something new. They were trying to endure something they didn't fully understand. And that shift, from ambition to survival, often marks the beginning of the end in stories like this. Then, just as suddenly as the colony had been established, it was abandoned. The remaining settlers made the decision to leave, returning to England and leaving behind everything they had built. The fort, the structures, the effort, all of it left to be reclaimed by the land. Unlike Roanoke, where an entire population vanished without explanation, the Popham colony did not disappear in secrecy. There were survivors, there were records, and yet the mystery remains, not in what happened, but in why it happened so quickly, and why a settlement that showed so much early promise collapsed almost immediately. Historians have spent years trying to piece together the reasons. Some point to the obvious factors: the harsh climate, the lack of preparation for northern winters, the scarcity of food, and the death of key leadership. Others suggest that the colony may never have been as stable as it appeared, that beneath the surface there were already signs of failure that simply weren't recorded in detail. There is also the possibility that the financial backing behind the colony played a role. Investors expected results, and when those results didn't come quickly enough, support may have weakened, leaving the settlers with fewer resources and fewer reasons to stay. But even with these explanations, something still feels incomplete. Colonies failed all the time during this period, but most left behind clearer reasons, clearer accounts of what went wrong. The Popham colony, in contrast, feels like a story with missing pieces. It begins with confidence, moves quickly into struggle, and then ends before we fully understand the transition between the two. It's not just a story in failure, it's a story that feels unfinished, as if something important was never recorded, or perhaps never fully understood, even by those who lived through it. What makes this mystery even more interesting is how easily it was overshadowed. Roanoke became the symbol of colonial disappearance, the story people remember when they think of lost settlements. But Popham, despite being better documented, faded into obscurity. It didn't vanish dramatically enough to capture imagination, and yet its quiet collapse may actually be more revealing. It shows how fragile these early attempts at colonization really were, how quickly things could unravel, even when everything seemed to be going right. In the 1990s, archaeological discoveries brought new attention to the site. The remains of the fort were uncovered, along with artifacts that confirmed the colony's existence and provided insight into how the settlers lived. These findings helped fill in some gaps, but they didn't answer the central question. They showed what the colony was, but not why it failed so completely. The physical evidence tells a story of construction, of effort, of presence, but it doesn't explain the decision to leave, or the factors that made staying impossible. And that's where the mystery continues. Because sometimes the most difficult questions aren't about what happened, but about what changed. What moment, what realization, what shift in perception caused an entire group of people to abandon everything they had worked for? Was it a slow build-up of problems that finally reached a breaking point? Or was there a specific event, something sudden, something unrecorded, that made the decision inevitable? It's also worth considering how much of this story has been lost simply because it wasn't seen as important at the time. History often preserves the dramatic, the unexplained, the sensational, but quieter failures, even significant ones, can fade if they don't fit the narrative people expect. The Popham colony may not have vanished without a trace, but in many ways it disappeared from memory, leaving behind just enough information to raise questions, but not enough to answer them. Today, the site where the colony once stood is calm, almost unremarkable. There are no visible signs of the struggle that took place there, no immediate reminders of the effort, the ambition, or the failure. But beneath that quiet surface lies a story that still resists full explanation. A story into people who came to build something lost and only to leave before it could take hold, leaving behind a mystery not of disappearance, but of sudden retreat. And perhaps that's what makes this story so unsettling. Not that the colony failed, but that it failed in a way we still don't completely understand. Because when a group of people chooses to leave everything behind, there is always a reason. Whether that reason is recorded or not, whether it is obvious or hidden, it exists. And in the case of the Popham colony, that reason remains just out of reach, buried somewhere between the fragments of history that survived and the ones that didn't. The shipwreck that turned into something far darker. In 1629, a massive Dutch ship set sail on what was supposed to be a routine journey, carrying people, cargo, and the expectations of a powerful trading empire across dangerous waters toward the East Indies. The ship was called the Batavia, and like many vessels of its time, it represented more than just transportation. It was a symbol of wealth, control, and ambition. Its journey was meant to strengthen the Dutch East India Company's influence over one of the most valuable trade networks in the world. But long before it could reach its destination, something went wrong, and what followed would become one of the most disturbing survival stories ever recorded. The Batavia ran aground during the night on a remote chain of coral islands off the coast of Western Australia, a place known today as the Abrolhos Islands. The crash itself was catastrophic, but not immediately fatal for most on board. A large number of passengers and crew managed to survive, escaping the wreck and making their way onto the surrounding islands. At first, survival seemed possible. The islands, though isolated, offered land, some resources, and a temporary sense of safety, but that sense would not last long. The environment they found themselves in was harsh and unforgiving. Fresh water was scarce, food was limited, and the landscape itself offered little protection. The survivors were stranded in one of the most isolated places imaginable, with no immediate hope of rescue. In situations like this, survival depends not just on resources, but on leadership, cooperation, and trust. And in the case of the Batavia, those elements began to collapse almost immediately. The ship's commander left the islands in a small boat with a few men, attempting to reach the mainland to organize a rescue mission. This decision, while logical, created a dangerous power vacuum among the remaining survivors. Without clear authority, the group was left to organize itself, and in that uncertainty, a man named Jeronimus Cornelis began to rise. Cornelis was not a typical leader. He had no official command, no formal authority, but he possessed something far more influential in a desperate situation: control over people's fear. He was intelligent, manipulative, and able to present himself as someone who understood what needed to be done. At first, his actions may have seemed practical, even necessary, but slowly, his intentions began to reveal themselves, and they were far from survival-focused. Cornelis began to divide the survivors, separating those he trusted from those he didn't. He formed a group around himself, gaining loyalty through intimidation and promises of safety. Those outside his inner circle became a threat in his eyes, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they existed as potential opposition. In an environment where resources were limited and authority was unstable, control became more important than cooperation. What followed was not just a breakdown of order, but the creation of something far more disturbing. Cornelis began orchestrating acts of violence against other survivors. At first, these acts may have been framed as necessary decisions, eliminating those who were considered weak or dangerous. But over time, the violence became systematic. People were executed, abandoned, or left to die. Entire groups were removed under the justification of maintaining control. The islands, once a place of survival, turned into something closer to a controlled nightmare. Cornelis ruled through fear, and those who followed him either believed in his authority or were too afraid to challenge it. The absence of external oversight allowed his control to grow unchecked. In many ways, the situation became a small, isolated version of something much larger, a demonstration of how quickly structure can collapse and be replaced by something far more dangerous when the right conditions are present. But the most unsettling part of the Batavia story is not just the violence that occurred, but what came after. As time passed, reports began to surface of people disappearing without explanation. Not killed publicly, not executed as part of Cornelis's actions, but simply gone. Men, women, and children who had been seen one day were no longer there the next. In an environment as small and controlled as those islands, this made no sense. There were no places to hide, no forests to disappear into, no structures to escape through. And yet, people vanished. Some assumed these disappearances were simply part of Cornelis's violence, hidden acts meant to maintain control without drawing attention. It would make sense in a situation where fear was being used as a tool, but even this explanation doesn't fully account for the lack of evidence. Bodies were not found, witnesses were limited, and the pattern of disappearances didn't always align with the known actions of his group. Another possibility is that some survivors attempted to escape, leaving the main group and venturing into the harsher parts of the islands in search of water or safety. But the environment was so unforgiving that survival outside the main group would have been nearly impossible. If they had tried to leave, they likely would not have lasted long, and yet no remains were ever clearly identified to confirm this. There was also the psychological factor to consider. The conditions on the islands were extreme, not just physically, but mentally. The survivors had experienced a shipwreck, isolation, fear, and ongoing violence. In such an environment, perception can become unreliable. People may misremember events, overlook details, or fail to notice changes until it is too late. It's possible that the disappearances were not as mysterious as they seem, but rather the result of chaos and confusion. But even this explanation leaves gaps. Eventually, rescue did come. The commander who had left the islands managed to return with help, and the situation that had developed under Cornelis's control was exposed. The surviving mutineers were captured, tried, and punished. Cornelis himself was executed for his role in the events. Justice, in a sense, was served. But justice does not erase what happened, and it does not answer every question. Even after the rescue, the mystery of the missing survivors remained unresolved. Records from the time focus heavily on the mutiny, the violence, and the eventual punishment, but the details of those who disappeared are less clear. Their stories were not fully documented, their fates not fully explained. They became part of the larger narrative, but without individual resolution. In the years that followed, historians and researchers have tried to reconstruct the events of the Batavia, using journals, testimonies, and archaeological evidence. Excavations of the wreck and the islands have provided valuable insights into how the survivors lived and what they endured. But despite these efforts, the full picture remains incomplete. There are still moments in the timeline that don't fully connect, still questions about what happened during certain periods, still uncertainties about how many people survived and how many were lost in ways that were never recorded. The Batavia story is often remembered as a tale of shipwreck and mutiny, but it is also something more complex. It is a case study in how quickly human behavior can change under pressure, how leadership can shift from structure to control, and how survival situations can reveal aspects of human nature that are difficult to understand. It also raises a deeper question about what happens when people are removed from systems of accountability, when there are no rules except those created by whoever holds power. And then there are the disappearances, the quiet, unresolved element that sits beneath the more dramatic parts of the story. They don't define the narrative, but they complicate it. They suggest that even within a well-documented event, there can still be elements that remain unclear, pieces that don't fit neatly into the explanation. Today, the Batavia is studied as one of the most extreme examples of survival gone wrong. Its wreck has been examined, its artifacts preserved, and its story retold in countless ways. But despite all of that, it still holds on to its mystery. Not in the broad events, but in the smaller details, the moments that were not fully recorded, the people who were not fully accounted for. Because sometimes, even when we know most of the story, it's the parts we don't know that stay with us the longest. The unanswered questions, the missing pieces, the individuals who disappeared without explanation. They remind us that history is not always complete, that even the most studied events can still contain gaps, and that those gaps can be just as important as the facts we think we understand. The nun who burned but left no marks. In the early 1600s, in the northern Italian town of Monza, a place defined by religious authority and quiet discipline, a story began to unfold that would challenge not only the limits of belief, but the limits of explanation itself. Monza was not an ordinary town. It held political importance, spiritual influence, and a structure where power and faith were deeply connected. At the center of it all stood the convent, a place where women were expected to live lives of devotion, silence, and obedience. It was within these walls that a young nun named Sister Virginia became part of a mystery that still raises uncomfortable questions centuries later. At first, her life appeared no different from the others around her. She had taken her vows, committed herself to the expectations of religious life, and existed within a system that allowed very little freedom. But beneath that surface, There were tensions that were not immediately visible. The convent was not just a place of peace. It was also a place of pressure, strict control, and isolation. For many, it was not a choice, but a path decided by family, status, or circumstance. And in environments like this, where expression is limited and emotion is restrained, conflicts often build in silence. Virginia's story began to shift when her name became connected to someone outside the convent walls, a man named John Paolo Osio, a local nobleman with influence, power, and a reputation that made him both respected and feared. Their relationship, if the accounts are accurate, was not simply a passing interaction. It was a secret connection that crossed the boundaries of religious life and placed Virginia in a position that was both dangerous and difficult to escape. In a society where reputation and control mattered deeply, such a relationship could not remain hidden forever. As rumors began to spread, the situation became increasingly unstable. Virginia was no longer just a nun living quietly within the convent. She became a figure surrounded by suspicion, judgment, and attention. The pressure around her grew not only from the possibility of exposure, but from the expectations of the institution she was part of. The conflict she faced was not just personal, it was structural. She was caught between two worlds, neither of which allowed her to exist freely. Then something happened that transformed the story from scandal into mystery. Virginia was found after what was described as an act of self-inflicted burning. According to initial accounts, she had set herself on fire, an act that was interpreted as desperation, guilt, or an attempt to escape the situation she found herself in. At first, the explanation seemed tragic but understandable. A person under extreme pressure, unable to reconcile her circumstances, choosing an extreme way out. But the details did not align. Witnesses who saw her body reported something unusual. The burns that should have been present were either minimal or completely absent. Her body, according to some accounts, did not show the level of damage that would be expected from such an act. The fire, which should have left clear evidence, seemed to have affected her in a way that did not follow normal physical outcomes. This contradiction became the center of the mystery. If she had truly set herself on fire, why were the expected injuries not present? And if the injuries were not present, then what exactly had happened? The explanation provided by authorities at the time was simple. It was declared a suicide, a tragic result of emotional and psychological strain. The case was closed quickly, and the narrative was controlled. In a system where maintaining order and avoiding scandal was essential, there was little interest in exploring inconsistencies. A clear explanation, even if incomplete, was more useful than a complicated truth. But the questions did not disappear. Some began to suggest that the situation was not as straightforward as it seemed. The relationship with Osio added another layer of complexity. He was not an ordinary man. He held influence, and in a society structured around power, influence often meant protection. If Virginia had become a liability, someone who could expose information or create further scandal, there would have been strong motivation to silence her. This possibility introduced a darker interpretation of the events. Could her death have been staged? Could the fire have been used as a cover for something else? And if so, why did the physical evidence not align with the story that was presented? Others approached the mystery from a different angle. Instead of focusing on external forces, they looked at the psychological environment Virginia was living in. The convent, with its strict rules and isolation, could create intense internal pressure. Combined with the emotional conflict of her situation, it is possible that her actions were not fully rational. But even this explanation struggles to account for the physical inconsistencies. Psychological distress can explain behavior, but it does not explain the absence of expected physical outcomes. There are also more unusual theories, ones that move beyond conventional explanations. Some have suggested that the condition of her body could have been misreported, exaggerated over time as the story was retold. In historical cases, especially those involving unusual events, details can change, becoming more dramatic or more mysterious with each retelling. If this is the case, then the mystery may not lie in the event itself, but in how it was recorded and remembered. However, this theory raises another question. If the details were exaggerated, why did the story persist? Why did it continue to be discussed, debated, and questioned long after the event itself had passed? Stories that are entirely explainable tend to fade, but this one did not. Another possibility is that the physical observations were accurate but misunderstood. In rare cases, certain conditions or environmental factors can affect how the body reacts to fire. But even these explanations are limited, and none fully match the descriptions provided. The gap between what should have happened and what was reported remains difficult to reconcile. The role of the church and local authorities also cannot be ignored. In a time when reputation and control were critical, managing information was often just as important as managing events. If something unusual had occurred, something that did not fit within accepted understanding, there would have been strong incentive to simplify the narrative. A clear, controlled explanation would prevent panic, protect reputations, and maintain order. This leads to a broader question about how much of the story we are missing. What details were never recorded? What information was removed or altered? And how much of what we know is shaped by the need to present a version of events that was acceptable at the time? Today, the story of Sister Virginia remains one of the more unusual cases from that period. It is not widely known, and it does not carry the same level of attention as other historical mysteries, but it persists in a different way. It lingers in discussions about unexplained phenomena, about the limits of historical documentation, and about the ways in which truth can be shaped by those who control the narrative. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not just the event itself, but the uncertainty surrounding it. There is no clear resolution, no definitive explanation that fully accounts for all the details. Instead, there are multiple possibilities, each addressing part of the story, but none addressing all of it. Was it a tragic act of desperation that was later misunderstood? Was it a controlled narrative designed to hide something more complex? Or was it an event that simply does not fit within the explanations we are used to relying on? The town of Monza continues to exist, its history layered with events both ordinary and extraordinary. The convent, once a place of strict discipline, is now part of a broader historical landscape. But the story of Sister Virginia remains unresolved, not because it lacks attention, but because it resists clear interpretation. And perhaps that is what makes it endure. Not the certainty of what happened, but the uncertainty of how it happened. Because when an event challenges both physical expectation and historical explanation, it forces us to consider something uncomfortable, that not everything can be easily understood, and that sometimes, even when all the pieces seem to be present, the full picture remains just out of reach. The town where people woke up with their hair gone, in the summer of 1942, in the small coastal town of Pascagoula, Mississippi, life followed a rhythm that felt predictable and safe. It was the middle of World War I, and while the world beyond the town was filled with uncertainty, Pascagoula itself remained relatively quiet. People worked, families stayed close, and nights were expected to pass without incident. There was no reason to believe that anything unusual would happen there, let alone something that would leave the entire community confused, unsettled, and searching for answers that would never come. The first incident seemed too minor to take seriously. A young girl woke up one morning to find that a portion of her hair had been cut off while she slept. At first, it was dismissed as a prank, something done by a sibling, or perhaps a misunderstanding. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had entered the house during the night. The explanation didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be simple enough to move on. But within days, similar reports began to surface, and the situation quickly stopped feeling like a coincidence. More people came forward, describing nearly identical experiences. They would go to sleep as usual, only to wake up and discover that sections of their hair were missing. In some cases, the hair was found neatly placed nearby, as if it had been cut with intention rather than carelessness. The cuts themselves were precise, not random or uneven, suggesting that whoever or whatever was responsible knew exactly what they were doing. This detail made the situation more unsettling, because it implied control, not chaos. As the number of incidents grew, so did the concern. This was no longer an isolated event, it was a pattern, and patterns demand explanation. People began locking their doors more carefully, checking windows and paying closer attention to anything unusual. But despite these precautions, the incidents continued. There were still no signs of forced entry, no evidence of intrusion, and no witnesses who could confirm seeing anyone responsible. It was as if the events were happening without anyone being there. The town quickly shifted from confusion to fear. The idea that someone could enter homes undetected, approach sleeping individuals, and leave without a trace was deeply unsettling. It suggested a level of access and invisibility that didn't seem possible. People began to question not just who was responsible, but how it was even happening. The lack of answers made the situation feel more threatening than the act itself. Authorities were called in to investigate, but from the beginning they faced the same problem as everyone else. There was no clear evidence to follow. No footprints, no broken locks, no disturbed surroundings. The home showed no signs of intrusion, and the victims had no memory of anything unusual during the night. Without physical evidence, the investigation relied heavily on reports and patterns, but even those did not lead to a clear suspect. Some theories began to emerge, each attempting to make sense of the situation in a way that felt reasonable. One of the most common explanations was that the incidents were the work of a single individual, someone with a specific fixation or compulsion. The precision of the cuts suggested skill, and the consistency of the method suggested planning. If this were the case, then the person responsible would have to be familiar with the area, comfortable moving unnoticed, and capable of entering homes without detection. But this theory raised as many questions as it answered. How could someone repeatedly enter homes without leaving any trace? And why had no one ever seen or heard them? Another explanation pointed toward the possibility of pranks or coordinated activity. In a small town, it would not be impossible for a group of people to create a series of incidents designed to confuse or frighten others. But this theory struggled to account for the scale and consistency of the reports. Too many people were involved, and the details were too similar to suggest random or independent actions. If it was a prank, it was one that required an unusual level of coordination and secrecy. There was also the idea that the incidents were influenced by the psychological environment of the time. The country was at war, and even in quieter towns, the sense of uncertainty was present. Anxiety, stress, and fear can affect perception, and in some cases, can lead to shared experiences that feel real, but are not based on a physical cause. This concept, often referred to as mass hysteria, has been used to explain similar events in other contexts. If one person experiences something unusual and others hear about it, it can influence how they interpret their own experiences. Over time, this can create a pattern that appears real, even if there is no single cause. However, this explanation also has limitations. The physical evidence, specifically the cut hair, was real. People were not imagining the results, even if their interpretation of the cause could be influenced. This makes it difficult to fully attribute the events to psychological factors alone. There had to be something causing the hair to be cut, even if the exact method remained unclear. As the investigation continued, reports began to include additional details that made the situation even more difficult to explain. Some individuals claimed to have heard faint noises during the night, but nothing distinct enough to identify. Others described a feeling of unease, as if they were being watched, even before discovering the missing hair. These details were not consistent across all reports, but they added to the overall sense that something unusual was happening. Despite the growing attention, no clear suspect was ever identified. The incidents continued for a period of time, affecting multiple households, and then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. There was no final event, no resolution, no explanation that brought closure. The pattern simply ended, leaving behind a series of reports that could not be fully explained. The sudden end of the incidents is perhaps one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. If the events were caused by a person, why did they stop? Did the individual leave the area, lose interest, or become aware of the investigation? If it was a coordinated effort, why did it not continue or escalate? And if the explanation lies in psychological or environmental factors, what changed to bring it to an end? Over time, the story of the Pascagoula incidents became part of local history, remembered and retold in different ways. Some view it as an example of how fear can spread through a community, shaping how people interpret their experiences. Others see it as a case that was never fully investigated, leaving open the possibility that a real individual was responsible but never identified. And there are those who consider the possibility that the explanation may not fit neatly into any of the usual categories. What makes this case particularly interesting is not just the events themselves, but the way they challenge expectations. The act of cutting hair is not inherently dangerous, but the context in which it occurred transforms it into something unsettling. It suggests intrusion without evidence, action without presence, and a level of access that feels impossible. These elements combine to create a situation that is difficult to resolve, even with multiple plausible explanations. The town of Pascagoula eventually returned to its normal rhythm. The fear faded, the report stopped, and life continued as it had before. But the story did not disappear completely. It remained as a reminder that even in places that feel safe and predictable, events can occur that do not fit within our usual understanding. And that may be the most lasting impact of this case. Not the act itself, but the realization that something can happen repeatedly, affect multiple people, and still leave behind no clear explanation. It challenges the assumption that every event can be traced, every action understood, and every mystery resolved. Because sometimes, even when something happens in plain sight, the details are not enough to explain it. And when the evidence exists without a clear cause, the questions tend to remain long after the events themselves have ended. The ship found perfectly intact but completely empty. In January of 1921, along the dangerous and unpredictable coastline of North Carolina, a ship was spotted in a position that immediately raised concern. It was not sinking, not damaged beyond recognition, and not showing signs of distress in the way most stranded vessels do. Instead, it appeared almost calm, resting where it should not have been, as if it had simply drifted into the wrong place and stopped. The ship was the Carroll A. Deering, a 5-masted schooner known for transporting cargo along the eastern seaboard, and what made this discovery unusual was not the ship itself, but what was missing from it. When rescuers approached the vessel, they expected to find a crew struggling to survive, or at least some indication of what had gone wrong. Instead, they found something far more unsettling. The ship was completely empty. There were no crew members on board, no signs of panic, and no immediate evidence of violence. Everything appeared to be in order, as if the people who had been on the ship had simply stepped away and never returned. The sails were still set, the equipment was still in place, and the cargo had not been disturbed. It was not a scene of chaos, but a scene of absence. As investigators began to examine the ship more closely, the details became even more confusing. Personal belongings were still present, suggesting that the crew had not prepared to leave. Food supplies were intact, indicating that there had been no immediate shortage or crisis that would force an evacuation. There were no signs of a struggle, no damage that would point to an attack, and no clear reason why the ship would have been abandoned in such a condition. The only thing that was clearly missing, aside from the crew, was the ship's logbook. The absence of the logbook was significant. In maritime travel, the logbook serves as a record of the ship's journey, documenting conditions, decisions, and events that occur along the way. It is one of the most important tools for understanding what happens at sea, especially in situations where something goes wrong. Without it, investigators were left without a timeline, without context, and without the ability to trace the ship's final movements in detail. It was as if the most important piece of information had been deliberately removed. The last confirmed sighting of the Carroll A. Deering, before it was found stranded, came from a lighthouse keeper who reported that the ship appeared to be moving erratically. According to his account, the vessel did not seem to be under normal control. The crew's behavior, as observed from a distance, appeared unusual, though not clearly threatening or desperate. This sighting added another layer of uncertainty. If the ship was not being navigated properly, something must have already been wrong before it reached the shore. But without the logbook or any surviving crew members, there was no way to confirm what that problem might have been. One of the earliest theories proposed was mutiny. The idea that the crew may have turned against their captain or each other is not uncommon in maritime history, especially under stressful conditions. There were reports suggesting that tensions had existed among the crew prior to the ship's final voyage, and in isolated environments like the open sea, even minor conflicts can escalate quickly. If a mutiny had occurred, it could explain the erratic movement of the ship and the absence of leadership. However, this theory raises several questions. If the crew had taken control of the ship, why would they abandon it entirely, leaving behind their belongings and supplies? And if they had left, where did they go? Another possibility that was considered was piracy. At the time, piracy was not unheard of, and it could provide an explanation for the disappearance of the crew. But once again, the evidence did not support this theory. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage consistent with an attack, and no valuables had been taken. Pirates, by definition, are motivated by gain, and in this case, nothing appeared to have been stolen. The ship itself was left intact, which contradicts the typical outcome of a pirate encounter. There was also speculation about environmental factors. The waters off the coast of North Carolina are known for being particularly dangerous, with shifting sands, strong currents, and unpredictable weather conditions. It is possible that the ship encountered a natural hazard that disrupted its course and forced the crew into a difficult situation. However, even in such cases, there are usually signs of distress, damage, or attempts to stabilize the vessel. The condition of the Carol A. Deering did not reflect a struggle against nature. It reflected something far more controlled, or at least something that did not leave visible traces. As the investigation continued, attention turned to the possibility of mechanical failure or navigational error. If something had gone wrong with the ship's equipment, it could have caused the crew to lose control and attempt to abandon the vessel. But again, this theory does not fully explain the lack of evidence. There were no clear signs of malfunction, and the ship's overall condition suggested that it was still operational. If the crew had chosen to leave, it would have been a decision made under circumstances that were not immediately visible. Over time, more unusual theories began to emerge. Some suggested that the crew may have encountered something unexpected at sea, something that caused them to leave the ship suddenly and without preparation. These theories range from encounters with unknown vessels to more speculative ideas involving unexplained phenomena. While these explanations are difficult to verify, they persist because of the lack of concrete evidence supporting more conventional theories. The missing logbook remains one of the most critical elements of the mystery. Its absence suggests that someone, at some point, removed it intentionally. Whether this was done by a member of the crew, an external party, or as part of an unknown event, it indicates that the information it contained was important. It may have recorded the events leading up to the ship's abandonment, providing clarity that is now permanently lost. Without it, the investigation relies on incomplete data and second-hand accounts, making it difficult to reach a definitive conclusion. The disappearance of the crew also raises questions about what happened after they left the ship. If they abandoned the vessel, they would have needed a means of survival, such as lifeboats or rafts. Yet no confirmed remains of such equipment were found, and no bodies were recovered. This absence of evidence suggests that whatever happened to the crew occurred beyond the immediate vicinity of the ship, or in a way that left no trace. In maritime cases, it is not uncommon for evidence to be lost to the ocean, but the complete lack of findings in this case is unusual. The Carol A. Deering remains one of the most discussed maritime mysteries of the early 20th century. It is often grouped with other unexplained disappearances, particularly those associated with the broader region sometimes referred to as the Bermuda Triangle. While this connection is largely speculative, it reflects the broader challenge of explaining events that do not fit within established patterns. The ship's condition, the missing crew, and the lack of evidence create a scenario that is difficult to resolve using standard investigative methods. What makes this case particularly enduring is the contrast between what is known and what is not. The ship was found, its condition documented, and its existence confirmed. Yet the most important aspects of the story, the actions of the crew and the events leading up to their disappearance, remain unknown. This imbalance creates a situation where the available information is not enough to form a complete narrative, leaving room for interpretation and speculation. Today, the story of the Carol A. Deering continues to be examined by historians, researchers, and those interested in unexplained phenomena. New theories are proposed, old ones are revisited, and the details are analyzed from different perspectives. But despite these efforts, the core mystery remains unchanged. A ship was found in near-perfect condition, abandoned without explanation, and the people who once occupied it were never seen again. In cases like this, the absence of evidence becomes the central focus. It is not just what is missing, but what that absence implies. It suggests that something occurred that either left no trace or that the trace was removed. It challenges the assumption that every event can be reconstructed through investigation, and it highlights the limitations of our understanding when key pieces of information are no longer available. The Carol A. Deering stands as a reminder that even in well-documented periods of history, there are events that resist explanation, not because they are beyond understanding, but because the information needed to understand them has been lost, removed, or never recorded in the first place. And in those gaps where certainty cannot exist, the mystery continues. The town that believed it was being gassed at night. In 1944, during one of the most tense periods of the 20th century, a quiet American town called Mattoon, Illinois, became the center of a mystery that seemed to defy both logic and investigation. At a time when the world was already filled with uncertainty due to World War I, the people of Mattoon found themselves facing something much closer to home, something they could not see, could not fully understand, and could not stop. It began with a smell, faint at first, almost easy to ignore, but strong enough to leave an impression. Those who noticed it described it in different ways. Some called it sweet, others said it was chemical, but nearly all agreed on one thing: it did not belong. The first reports came from residents who experienced sudden symptoms late at night. They described dizziness, nausea, and a strange weakness that seemed to come without warning. In some cases, people claimed they were unable to move for a short period of time, as if their bodies had temporarily stopped responding. These incidents were not isolated. Within days, more people began reporting similar experiences, often describing the same sequence of events: a strange odor, followed by physical symptoms, and then a lingering sense that something had entered their homes without their knowledge. As the number of reports increased, the situation quickly shifted from concern to fear. People began to believe that someone was deliberately releasing gas into homes during the night. The idea was not entirely unrealistic for the time. The war had introduced the public to the concept of chemical attacks, and the fear of such weapons being used on civilians was very real. In this context, the reports from Mattoon did not seem impossible, they seemed plausible, which made them even more alarming. Witnesses began to describe seeing a figure near their homes, often at night, moving quickly and disappearing before they could be clearly identified. The descriptions were vague, usually involving a dark silhouette or a person dressed in black. Some claimed to hear hissing sounds, as if a device was being used to release something into the air. These details added to the narrative, creating the image of a person, or perhaps multiple individuals, carrying out a series of targeted attacks. The local authorities were quickly involved, and investigations began almost immediately. Police officers responded to reports, inspected homes, and attempted to identify any evidence that could confirm the presence of a gas or a device used to release it. However, despite the number of incidents, no physical evidence was found. There were no chemical residues, no containers, no tools, and no clear signs of entry. The lack of evidence created a problem. The reports were consistent, the symptoms were real, but there was nothing to confirm the cause. As the situation continued, the number of reported cases grew. Dozens of residents came forward, each with their own account, but with details that often matched those of others. This consistency made it difficult to dismiss the events entirely. At the same time, the absence of evidence made it difficult to confirm them. The investigation reached a point where it could neither prove nor disprove what was happening, leaving the community in a state of uncertainty. One of the primary explanations that emerged was the idea of a single individual, someone who was intentionally creating fear by releasing some form of gas into homes. This theory aligned with the reports of a shadowy figure and the timing of the incidents, which often occurred at night. However, without physical evidence, this explanation remained speculative. If such a person existed, they would have had to operate with a level of precision and secrecy that made them nearly impossible to detect. Another explanation focused on the possibility of industrial or environmental factors. Mattoon was not isolated from industry, and it was suggested that the reported odors and symptoms could have been caused by chemicals released into the air from nearby facilities. Under certain conditions, these chemicals could enter homes and create effects similar to those described by residents. While this theory provided a potential physical explanation, it did not fully account for the timing and distribution of the incidents, which seemed too specific to be random. The idea of mass hysteria also became a significant part of the discussion. In situations where fear spreads quickly, especially during times of stress, it is possible for groups of people to experience similar symptoms without a single external cause. The war had already created a heightened sense of anxiety, and the reports from Mattoon could have acted as a trigger, leading others to interpret normal sensations as something more serious. Once the idea of a gasser was introduced, it could have influenced how people perceived their environment, causing them to connect unrelated experiences into a single narrative. This explanation, while supported by some experts, was not universally accepted. Many residents insisted that their experiences were real and could not be explained by suggestion alone. The physical symptoms they described were not imagined, and the consistency of the report suggested that something was happening, even if it could not be easily identified. This tension between psychological and physical explanations is what makes the Mattoon case particularly difficult to resolve. As the weeks passed, the reports began to decrease. The incidents became less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. There was no final event, no resolution, and no explanation that brought closure. The investigation was gradually reduced, and the town returned to its normal state. But the lack of a clear conclusion left behind a sense of unfinished business, a story that had ended without being fully understood. In the years that followed, the Mattoon incidents became a subject of study and debate. Some researchers used the case as an example of how mass hysteria can develop and spread, particularly in times of heightened anxiety. Others continue to explore the possibility of an external cause, suggesting that the lack of evidence did not necessarily mean the absence of a real event. The case has been revisited multiple times, with new perspectives and interpretations, but none have been able to provide a definitive answer. What makes this mystery particularly compelling is the balance between possibility and uncertainty. Each explanation offers a way to understand the events, but none of them fully accounts for all the details. The psychological theory explains the spread of fear and the consistency of reports, but struggles with the physical symptoms. The environmental theory provides a potential source, but does not match the specific patterns observed. The idea of a deliberate attacker fits the narrative created by witnesses, but lacks the evidence needed to support it. The town of Mattoon no longer experiences these events, and for many, the story has become a part of local history rather than a current concern. But the questions remain. What caused the symptoms that so many people experienced? Why did the incidents follow such a consistent pattern, and why did they stop as suddenly as they began? In situations like this, the absence of a clear answer often leads to multiple interpretations, each shaped by the perspective of the person considering it. Some will see it as a psychological phenomenon, others as an unsolved crime, and some as something that falls outside the usual categories of explanation. The Mattoon case does not force a single conclusion, and that is what allows it to persist. Because when an event affects an entire community, leaves behind consistent reports, and still cannot be fully explained, it challenges the idea that every mystery has a solution. It suggests that there are situations where the available information is not enough, where the evidence does not align with a single narrative, and where the truth, whatever it may be, remains just beyond reach. The signals that had no source and no meaning. During the height of a Cold War in the 1960s, when the world was divided by tension, secrecy, and constant surveillance, a small coastal station in Sweden began receiving signals that no one could explain. The location was ordinary, used for standard maritime communication and monitoring, a place where operators were trained to recognize patterns, decode transmissions, and identify anything that didn't belong. At first, what they detected seemed like nothing more than interference, the kind of background noise that often appears in radio systems. But as time passed, it became clear that this was something different, something structured, consistent, and far too deliberate to ignore. The signals did not arrive randomly. They followed a pattern, repeating at intervals that suggested intention rather than coincidence. Each transmission consisted of distinct bursts of sound, separated by periods of silence that were almost perfectly timed. The rhythm was precise, almost mechanical, but it did not match any known communication system. It was not standard Morse code, not a military frequency, and not a civilian broadcast. It existed outside the categories that the operators were trained to recognize, which made it difficult to classify and even more difficult to explain. As the operators continued to monitor the signals, they began to notice changes. The patterns evolved, becoming more complex over time. What started as simple bursts of sound developed into sequences that resembled coded messages, though no one could decipher them. Some transmissions included tones that varied in pitch and duration, creating sequences that felt like language, but without any clear structure that could be translated. Others were more continuous, producing a low, steady hum that suggested a source far more powerful than typical communication equipment. The most unsettling aspect of these signals was their origin, or rather, the lack of one. Efforts to trace the transmissions led nowhere. The signals did not appear to come from a fixed location, and attempts to triangulate their source produced inconsistent results. It was as if the signals were being broadcast from multiple directions at once, or from a point that could not be physically identified. In a time when radio technology was well understood and widely used, this kind of anomaly was not just unusual, it was deeply concerning. Given the political climate of the era, one of the first explanations considered was that the signals were part of a covert military operation. The Cold War was defined by secrecy, and both sides were constantly developing new methods of communication and surveillance. It was possible that these signals were encrypted transmissions, designed to be difficult to detect and even harder to decode. If that were the case, then the inability to understand them would not be surprising. It would be intentional. However, even this explanation had limitations. The signals did not match the known characteristics of military communication, and no intelligence agency claimed responsibility for them. Another possibility was that the signals were the result of experimental technology, perhaps a new form of communication being tested in secret. This would explain their unusual structure and the difficulty in identifying their source. But again, there was no evidence to support this theory. No documentation, no acknowledgement, and no indication that such experiments were taking place in the area. In a field where even the most secretive projects tend to leave some kind of trace, the complete absence of information was unusual. Some researchers began to consider natural explanations, suggesting that the signals could be caused by atmospheric phenomena or interference from environmental sources. Under certain conditions, radio waves can behave unpredictably, reflecting off layers of the atmosphere and creating patterns that seem structured but are actually random. However, the consistency and repetition of the signals made this explanation difficult to accept. Natural interference tends to be irregular, not precise, and it rarely maintains the kind of pattern observed in this case. As the mystery continued, more speculative theories began to emerge. Some suggested that the signals could be coming from outside the Earth, possibly as part of an attempt at communication from an unknown source. This idea, while often dismissed as unlikely, gained attention because of the characteristics of the transmissions. The patterns, the repetition, and the apparent complexity all suggested intention, and in the absence of a known human source, the possibility of a non-human origin was considered, at least by those willing to explore unconventional explanations. Despite the growing interest, no clear progress was made in understanding the signals. They continued to be recorded, analyzed, and discussed, but no one was able to decode their meaning or identify their source. Over time, the frequency of the transmissions appeared to decrease, and eventually they stopped altogether. Just like many other unexplained events, the signals disappeared as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind recordings and reports, but no answers. The disappearance of the signals raised as many questions as their presence. If they were part of a deliberate communication, why did they stop? If they were the result of a natural phenomenon, what changed to end them? And if they were connected to some form of technology, why was there no further development or repetition? The lack of continuation made it difficult to study the phenomenon further, as there was no longer anything to observe directly. In the years that followed, the recordings of the signals were revisited by researchers using more advanced technology. Digital analysis, pattern recognition, and other modern techniques were applied in an attempt to uncover structure or meaning that had not been detected before. While some patterns were identified, none provided a definitive answer. The signals remained resistant to interpretation, existing as data without context, information without explanation. What makes this case particularly challenging is the combination of structure and uncertainty. The signals were not random, they followed patterns that suggested design. But without a known source or a way to decode them, those patterns could not be translated into meaning. This creates a situation where the evidence points toward intention, but the lack of context prevents any clear conclusion. The story of the Swedish signals is not widely known, but it represents a broader category of mysteries that involve communication without understanding. In a world where most signals can be traced, identified, and decoded, The existence of transmissions that resist all of these processes is unusual. It highlights the limitations of our technology and our ability to interpret information, especially when that information does not fit within established frameworks. It also raises questions about how we define communication. A signal, by itself, is just a sequence of data. It becomes communication when it can be understood, when it can be connected to a source and interpreted as a message. In this case, the signals never reached that stage. They remained as patterns, as sounds, as something that clearly existed but could not be fully explained. Today, the mystery of these signals remains unresolved. The recordings still exist, the reports are still available, and the questions are still open. Some view the case as an example of unexplained technology, others as a natural anomaly, and some as something that falls outside current understanding. Each interpretation offers a different perspective, but none provide a complete explanation. Because in the end, the most difficult mysteries are not the ones with no evidence, but the ones with evidence that cannot be interpreted. The signals were real, they were recorded, and they were studied. But without a way to understand them, they remain as one of the many reminders that not everything we encounter can be easily explained, and that sometimes, even when something is clearly present, its meaning can remain just out of reach. The man with a passport from a country that doesn't exist. In the summer of 1954, at Tokyo International Airport, a man arrived who, at first glance, seemed completely ordinary. He was well-dressed, calm, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to traveling. His documents appeared legitimate. His behavior raised no immediate concern, and his arrival should have been routine. But within minutes of reviewing his passport, immigration officials realized that something about him did not make sense. It wasn't his appearance, his language, or even his travel history that caused concern. It was the country listed on his passport, a country that no one had ever heard of. The passport identified the man as being from a nation called Tard. According to the document, this country existed in Europe with its own government, its own borders, and its own international recognition. The problem was that no such country existed on any map, in any database, or in any official record. When questioned, the man seemed confused by the reaction. He insisted that Tard was a real place, one that had existed for centuries. He spoke with certainty, not hesitation, as if the officials questioning him were the ones who were mistaken. To clarify the situation, the man was shown a map of Europe and asked to point out where Tard was located. Without hesitation, he pointed to a region between France and Spain, the area where the small country of Andorra exists today. But when officials told him that the location he indicated was Andorra, not Torrid, he became visibly frustrated. He insisted that Andorra did not exist, that the land had always been Tard, and that he had no understanding of why the name had changed. His reaction did not appear staged or uncertain. It appeared genuine, as if he was encountering something impossible. Further examination of his passport only deepened the mystery. The document contained stamps from multiple countries, suggesting that he had traveled internationally without issue before arriving in Tokyo. These stamps appeared authentic, matching the style and format used by official border authorities. If the passport was forged, it was done with an extraordinary level of detail, far beyond what would be expected from a typical counterfeit. Yet even the most carefully forged document cannot create a country that does not exist. The man's behavior added another layer of complexity. He spoke multiple languages fluently, including French and English, and answered questions in a way that suggested he was not confused about his identity or his situation. He did not appear to be under stress or experiencing any form of visible psychological distress. Instead, he seemed frustrated by the inability of others to recognize what he considered to be basic facts. From his perspective, he was a legitimate traveler from a real country, being questioned for reasons that made no sense. Given the unusual nature of the case, authorities decided to detain the man temporarily while they investigated further. He was placed in a nearby hotel under supervision, with the intention of resolving the situation once more information could be gathered. His belongings were examined, and everything appeared consistent with his story. There were business documents, personal items, and additional identification, all of which supported the identity presented in his passport. Nothing about his possessions suggested deception, yet the central issue remained unresolved. The next morning, when officials returned to continue their investigation, the situation took an unexpected turn. The man was gone. His room had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry or escape. His belongings were still present, including his documents, clothing, and personal items. There was no indication that he had left voluntarily, and no evidence to suggest how he could have exited the room without being seen. It was as if he had simply disappeared. An immediate search was conducted, both within the hotel and in the surrounding area. Airport security was alerted, and records were checked to see if the man had attempted to leave the country. No trace of him was found. There were no reports of someone matching his description leaving the premises, no sightings, and no further evidence of his presence. The investigation, which had already been unusual, now faced a problem that was even more difficult to address. Not only was the man's identity unclear, but his disappearance had removed the only direct source of information. The case quickly became the subject of speculation. One of the more conventional explanations is that the entire incident was a misunderstanding or a fabrication, possibly involving a forged passport and a carefully constructed story. According to this view, the man may have been part of a scheme that was never fully uncovered, and his disappearance could have been planned in advance. However, this explanation struggles to account for the details of the case, particularly the apparent authenticity of the passport and the lack of evidence showing how he left the secured room. Another possibility is that the man was experiencing some form of psychological condition that caused him to believe in the existence of a country that did not exist. This could explain his certainty and his confusion when presented with conflicting information. But this theory does not address the physical evidence, including the passport and the travel stamps, which would require external validation. A personal belief, no matter how strong, does not create official documentation that can pass inspection. There are also theories that place the event within a broader context of unexplained phenomena. Some suggest that the man may have come from a different version of reality, a parallel world in which Tard exists in place of Andorra. According to this idea, his arrival in Tokyo was the result of an unintended crossing between realities, and his disappearance was a return to his original world. While this explanation is highly speculative, it persists because it addresses both the existence of the passport and the nature of his disappearance in a way that conventional theories cannot. Other interpretations focus on the possibility of a controlled narrative, suggesting that the case may have been part of a larger operation that was never disclosed. In this scenario, the man's identity, his documents, and his disappearance would all be elements of a coordinated effort, possibly related to intelligence activities during the Cold War. However, like many theories involving secrecy, this explanation lacks direct evidence and relies heavily on assumptions about information that may never be revealed. What makes this case particularly enduring is the combination of verified details and unexplained elements. The man was documented, his passport was examined, and his presence was confirmed by multiple officials. At the same time, the key aspects of the case, his country of origin and his disappearance, remain unresolved. This creates a situation where the event cannot be dismissed entirely, but also cannot be fully explained. Over time, the story of the man from Tard has been retold in different ways, with variations in detail and emphasis. Some accounts focus on the mystery of the passport, others on the disappearance, and some on the broader implications of the event. While the accuracy of every detail may be difficult to confirm, the core elements of the story remain consistent. A man arrived with documentation from a country that does not exist, and he later disappeared under circumstances that could not be explained. The case raises questions about how we define identity in reality. A passport is considered one of the most reliable forms of identification, a document that connects an individual to a recognized nation. When that connection is disrupted, when the nation itself cannot be verified, it challenges the systems we rely on to organize and understand the world. It suggests that there are limits to our frameworks, and that those limits can be exposed in unexpected ways. It also highlights the role of evidence in shaping our understanding of events. In this case, the evidence is both present and incomplete. The passport exists, the reports exist, and the investigation took place. But without a clear explanation, the evidence does not lead to a conclusion. Instead, it leads to multiple possibilities, each attempting to account for the same set of facts from a different perspective. Today, the story remains one of the more unusual cases associated with unexplained phenomena. It is not widely documented in official records, and much of what is known comes from secondary sources and retellings. This lack of primary documentation adds another layer of uncertainty, making it difficult to separate confirmed details from later interpretations. Yet the story into stones, not because it has been proven, but because it cannot be easily dismissed. Because when an event presents a combination of consistency and contradiction, when it includes both verifiable elements and unexplained outcomes, it resists simple classification. It becomes something that exists between explanation and mystery, a case that invites investigation but does not provide resolution. And in that space, where certainty is not possible, the questions remain, waiting for answers that may never fully arrive. The treasure code no one has ever been able to solve. In the early 19th century, a story began circulating in the United States about a hidden treasure so vast that, if found, it would instantly make its discoverer unimaginably wealthy. According to the account, a man named Thomas J. Beale had discovered a massive deposit of gold, silver, and precious jewels somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. Fearing that transporting such wealth would make him and his companions targets, Beale supposedly decided to hide the treasure in a secret location in Virginia. But instead of leaving behind a simple map or clear directions, he created something far more complex, a set of coded messages that would conceal the location of the treasure unless they were properly deciphered. The story might have faded into obscurity if not for a series of documents known as the Beale Papers, published in 1885 by a man named James B. Ward. These papers claim to contain the original ciphers left by Beale, along with an explanation of how the treasure was hidden and how the codes were meant to be solved. According to Ward, Beale had entrusted a box containing these ciphers to a man named Robert Morris, with instructions that it should only be opened if Beale did not return after a certain period of time. When Beale never came back, the box was eventually opened, revealing 3 separate coded messages. The first cipher, which was eventually solved, described the contents of the treasure in detail. It listed quantities of gold, silver, and jewels, along with their estimated value, confirming that the story, at least in part, was intended to describe something real. The method used to decode this first cipher involved a technique known as a book cipher, where numbers correspond to words in a specific text. In this case, the Declaration of Independence was used as the key, and once applied, it revealed a clear and coherent message about the treasure's contents. The existence of the solved cipher gave credibility to the entire story. It demonstrated that the codes were not random, that they followed a structure, and that they could, at least in theory, be decoded. But it also raised a more important question. If the first cipher could be solved, what about the others? The second cipher was believed to contain the exact location of the treasure, while the third was said to list the names of the individuals involved in hiding it. These 2 remaining ciphers became the focus of attention, as they held the key to turning the story from a legend into a discoverable reality. For more than a century, people have attempted to decode the second cipher. Cryptographers, historians, mathematicians, and amateur codebreakers have all tried to uncover its meaning. The cipher consists of a long sequence of numbers, similar in format to the first, suggesting that it might also use a book cipher method. However, despite countless attempts using different texts, patterns, and techniques, no one has been able to produce a solution that is both consistent and verifiable. The code remains intact, resisting every effort to break it. One of the most puzzling aspects of the second cipher is its structure. While it appears similar to the first, it does not respond to the same decoding method. This has led to the assumption that a different key text is required, one that has not yet been identified. Over the years, researchers have tested a wide range of possibilities, from historical documents to literary works, but none have produced a result that aligns with the expected outcome. This suggests that either the correct key has not been found, or the cipher operates on a different principle altogether. Another layer of the mystery involves the authorship of the cipher. While Thomas Beale is credited with creating the codes, there is no direct evidence confirming that he personally constructed the second cipher. Some researchers believe that the complexity of the code suggests the involvement of someone with advanced knowledge of cryptography, possibly someone who was not mentioned in the original story. If this is the case, then the cipher may have been designed with a level of sophistication that goes beyond typical methods used at the time. There is also the possibility that the cipher contains multiple layers of encryption. Instead of a single key, it may require a combination of methods, each revealing part of the message. This would explain why attempts using straightforward techniques have failed, as they would only address one layer of the code. However, this theory is difficult to test without additional information, and it adds to the complexity of an already challenging problem. Some have questioned whether the cipher is solvable at all. The idea that it could be a deliberate hoax has been discussed for many years. According to this theory, the Beale papers may have been created as a fictional story designed to attract attention and generate interest rather than to lead to an actual treasure. If this is true, then the second cipher may not contain a meaningful message, or it may have been constructed in a way that makes it impossible to decode. This would explain why no solution has been found, despite the extensive effort invested in trying. However, the existence of the first solved cipher complicates this theory. If the entire story were a fabrication, it would require the creator to design a functional code that could be decoded, while also creating additional codes that appear similar but do not yield results. This level of detail suggests a deliberate effort to create a convincing narrative, which raises the question of why such an effort would be made if there were no underlying truth. The third cipher, which is believed to contain the names of those involved in hiding the treasure, has also remained unsolved. While it has received less attention than the second cipher, it presents a similar challenge. Without a key, the sequence of numbers cannot be translated into meaningful information. If the second cipher were solved, it might provide clues that could be used to approach the third, but as long as the primary code remains unbroken, the others remain inaccessible as well. Over the years, advances in technology have introduced new methods of analysis. Computer algorithms, pattern recognition software, and statistical models have been applied to the cipher in an attempt to identify underlying structures or repeating sequences. While these tools have provided new insights, they have not produced a definitive solution. The cipher continues to resist interpretation, maintaining its status as one of the most enduring unsolved codes in history. The idea of a hidden treasure adds an additional dimension to the mystery. If the cipher does indeed lead to a real location, then it represents not just an intellectual challenge, but a tangible reward. This has motivated countless individuals to continue working on the problem, each hoping to be the one who finally uncovers the solution. At the same time, the lack of progress has led others to question whether the effort is justified, or whether the treasure, if it ever existed, has already been lost or removed. The Beale cipher case highlights the relationship between information and interpretation. A code, by itself, is simply a sequence of symbols or numbers. It becomes meaningful only when the correct key is applied. Without that key, the information remains inaccessible, regardless of how much effort is invested in trying to understand it. This creates a situation where the answer may exist, but remains out of reach. Not because it is hidden, but because the method of revealing it is unknown. It also raises questions about the nature of secrecy and intention. If the cipher was designed to protect the location of the treasure, then its effectiveness has been proven by the fact that it has remained unsolved for so long. At the same time, if it was meant to be eventually decoded, then something is missing, either the key itself or the knowledge required to use it. This uncertainty is what keeps the mystery alive, as each new attempt to solve the cipher is based on the assumption that a solution is possible. Today, the Beale cipher remains one of the most well-known unsolved puzzles. It exists at the intersection of history, cryptography, and speculation, drawing interest from those who are motivated by curiosity, challenge, or the possibility of discovery. Despite the passage of time and the development of new analytical tools, the core problem remains unchanged. The sequence of numbers is still there, waiting to be interpreted, and the treasure, if it exists, remains hidden. Because in cases like this, the mystery is not just about what is hidden, but about how it is hidden. It is about the gap between information and understanding, and the challenge of bridging that gap. And as long as that gap remains, the Beale cipher will continue to represent not just a puzzle, but a question, one that has been asked for generations and has yet to be answered. The house where something refused to stay unseen. In 1817, In a quiet rural area of Amherst, Nova Scotia, a family moved into a modest home expecting nothing more than a simple, predictable life. The house was ordinary, the surroundings peaceful, and there was no reason to believe that anything unusual would happen there. But within a short time, the atmosphere inside the home began to change in ways that no one could easily explain. What started as small disturbances quickly escalated into one of the most documented and debated cases of unexplained activity in history, known today as the Great Amherst Mystery. At first, the events were subtle. The family began hearing strange noises at night, knocks, scratching sounds, and movements that could not be easily traced to any visible source. In an older house, such sounds might be dismissed as natural, the result of shifting wood, wind, or small animals moving within the walls. But these sounds did not behave like ordinary disturbances. They followed patterns occurring at specific times and in ways that suggested intention rather than coincidence. The noises were not random, and over time, they became louder and more frequent. Soon, the disturbances began to take on a physical form. Objects in the house started to move without explanation. Items were displaced, thrown, or found in locations where they had not been left. At times, the movements were subtle, but in other instances they were forceful enough to cause damage. Furniture shifted, dishes broke, and the environment inside the home began to feel unstable. The family, initially confused, began to realize that what they were experiencing could not be explained by normal causes. The focus of the activity soon centered on one member of the family, a young woman named Esther Cox. The disturbances appeared to follow her, intensifying when she was present and decreasing when she was not. This pattern led observers to consider the possibility that the events were somehow connected to her, either as a cause or as a focal point. In cases of unexplained activity, such patterns are often significant, as they suggest that the phenomenon is not random, but linked to specific conditions or individuals. As the events continued, the nature of the disturbances became more aggressive. Esther reported experiencing physical interactions, sensations of being touched or pushed by an unseen force. On several occasions, she claimed that her body was affected directly, with marks appearing on her skin without any visible cause. Witnesses reported seeing her bed move violently, as if something were attempting to throw her from it. These incidents were not isolated, and they were observed by multiple people, including neighbors and visitors who had come to see the situation for themselves. The presence of witnesses is one of the factors that distinguishes this case from many others. The events were not confined to a single individual's account. They were observed, recorded, and in some cases, investigated by people who had no prior connection to the family. This does not confirm the nature of the phenomenon, but it does add a level of credibility to the reports. It suggests that something unusual was occurring, even if the cause remains unclear. As word of the events spread, the case attracted attention beyond the immediate community. A local actor named Walter Hubble became involved and later documented the events in detail. His account provides one of the most comprehensive descriptions of what occurred, including specific incidents, timelines, and observations. According to Hubble, the disturbances were not only real, but consistent in their behavior. He described objects moving in ways that could not be explained by natural forces and interactions that suggested the presence of an unseen entity. One of the most unusual aspects of the case was the apparent communication associated with the disturbances. At times, the noises in the house seemed to respond to questions or statements, as if there were an intelligence behind them. Knocks would occur in patterns, and in some instances they appeared to correspond to attempts at interaction. This led to the idea that whatever was causing the events was not only active, but aware. The theory of a poltergeist became the most widely accepted explanation for the events. In this context, a poltergeist is not necessarily a spirit in the traditional sense, but a form of energy that can cause physical disturbances. Some interpretations suggest that such activity may be linked to psychological or emotional states, particularly in individuals under stress. If this were the case, Esther's presence at the center of the activity could indicate that the phenomenon was connected to her in a way that was not fully understood. However, this explanation does not resolve all aspects of the case. While it provides a framework for understanding the physical disturbances, it does not fully account for the apparent intelligence or the consistency of the events. It also raises questions about the mechanism by which such activity could occur. as there is no widely accepted scientific explanation for how psychological states could produce physical effects of this magnitude. Another possibility is that the events were the result of deliberate actions, either by individuals within the household or by external parties. This would imply that the disturbances were staged or exaggerated, possibly for attention or other motives. However, this theory is difficult to support given the number of witnesses and the range of incidents reported. It would require a level of coordination and consistency that would be difficult to maintain over an extended period. There are also explanations that focus on environmental factors, suggesting that certain conditions within the house may have contributed to the experiences reported. For example, unusual air currents, structural issues, or even geological factors could potentially create sounds or movements that are misinterpreted. While these explanations can account for some aspects of the case, they do not fully explain the more complex interactions, particularly those involving physical contact or apparent communication. The events in the house continued for an extended period, with varying levels of intensity. At times, the disturbances seemed to subside, only to return later with renewed force. This pattern made it difficult to predict or control the situation, and it contributed to the overall sense of uncertainty. Eventually, the activity decreased and the case faded from immediate attention, but it did not disappear entirely. The records, accounts, and discussions surrounding the events continued to circulate, keeping the mystery alive. What makes the Great Amherst mystery particularly significant is the level of detail and documentation associated with it. Unlike many cases that rely on limited or second-hand accounts, this one includes multiple perspectives and written records from individuals who were directly involved. This does not guarantee accuracy, but it provides a more substantial basis for analysis and discussion. The case also highlights the challenges of interpreting unusual events. When something occurs that does not fit within established explanations, there is a tendency to apply familiar frameworks, whether they are psychological, environmental, or supernatural. Each of these approaches offers a way to understand the events, but none of them fully resolves the case. Instead, they provide partial explanations that address some aspects while leaving others unanswered. The house in Amherst no longer experiences the disturbances that were reported in 1817, and the events themselves are now part of historical record rather than current observation. But the questions remain. What caused the movements, the sounds, and the interactions that were observed? Why did the activity center around a specific individual? And why did it eventually stop? In examining cases like this, it becomes clear that the absence of a definitive explanation does not diminish the significance of the events. Instead, it emphasizes the complexity of interpreting experiences that fall outside of normal expectations. The Great Amherst mystery remains an example of how certain events can be observed, documented, and discussed without being fully understood. Because in the end, the challenge is not just to determine what happened, but to understand how it happened. And when the available explanations do not fully align with the observed details, the case remains open, not in the sense of an ongoing investigation, but as an unresolved question within the broader study of unexplained phenomena. The radio broadcast that repeated for years with no known source, in the middle of the 20th century, as radio technology became one of the most important tools for communication across the world, something unusual began to appear on certain frequencies. These were not ordinary transmissions, not music, news, or military communication. They were repetitive, often mechanical-sounding broadcasts that followed patterns no one could fully explain. Among these, one of the most well-known and unsettling became known as the UV-76 signal, often referred to as the buzzer, a broadcast that has continued for decades without a clear origin or confirmed purpose. The signal was first detected in the late 1970s, though some believe it may have existed earlier. It consisted of a constant buzzing sound, repeating at regular intervals, sometimes for hours, days, or even years with almost no interruption. The pattern was simple but precise, a short tone repeated over and over again like a machine running in the background. At first, it was assumed to be a technical artifact, perhaps a malfunction, or a piece of unused equipment transmitting unintentionally. But over time, it became clear that this was not random noise. It was consistent, maintained, and deliberately broadcast. What made the signal more unusual was what occasionally interrupted it. At irregular intervals, the buzzing would stop, and a voice would emerge. The voice, usually male, would speak in Russian, delivering a sequence of words, numbers, or names that appeared coded. These messages were brief, structured, and followed no pattern that could be easily decoded. After the message ended, the buzzing would resume, continuing as if nothing had happened. These interruptions were rare, but consistent enough to confirm that the signal was being actively maintained. Attempts to trace the source of the broadcast led to a general region within Russia, but no exact location was ever officially confirmed. Some investigations suggested that the signal originated from a military installation, possibly connected to a communication system used during the Cold War. This theory is supported by the nature of the messages, which resemble coded transmissions that could be used for secure communication. However, no government or organization has ever publicly acknowledged responsibility for the signal, leaving its purpose open to interpretation. One of the most widely accepted explanations is that the signal is part of a dead hand system, a type of automated communication network designed to function even if primary command structures are compromised. In this context, the continuous buzzing could serve as a marker, indicating that the system is active. If the signal were to stop, it could trigger a response or indicate a failure. The voice transmissions, then, could be periodic checks or updates within the system. While this explanation is plausible, it has never been confirmed, and it does not fully account for all aspects of the broadcast. Another theory suggests that the signal is used for number station communication, a method of transmitting coded messages to operatives using publicly accessible frequencies. Number stations have been documented in various countries, often involving sequences of numbers or words that can only be interpreted with a specific key. The UVB-76 signal shares some characteristics with these stations, particularly in its use of voice messages. However, most number stations do not operate continuously in the way that this signal does, making it somewhat unique. There are also more speculative explanations. Some believe the signal could be a form of psychological operation designed to create confusion or maintain a presence on certain frequencies. Others suggest that it could be an experimental technology, perhaps related to communication methods that are not widely understood. And as with many unexplained signals, there are even theories that place its origin outside of conventional human activity, though these ideas are not supported by evidence. What makes this case particularly unusual is its persistence. Unlike many other unexplained phenomena that appear briefly and then disappear, this signal has continued for decades. It has adapted to changes in technology, remained active through political shifts, and continued to broadcast even as global communication systems have evolved. This level of consistency suggests that the signal serves a purpose, even if that purpose is not publicly known. Over time, enthusiasts and researchers have monitored the signal, recording its patterns, documenting the voice transmissions, and attempting to analyze its structure. These recordings have been shared and studied, creating a body of data that provides insight into how the signal behaves. Despite this, no definitive interpretation has been reached. The messages remain undecoded, the purpose remains unclear, and the source remains officially unconfirmed. The existence of such a signal raises broader questions about communication and secrecy. In a world where most transmissions can be traced, identified, and understood, the presence of a broadcast that resists all of these processes is unusual. It suggests that there are systems operating beyond public awareness, using methods that are not easily interpreted by those outside of their intended audience. It also highlights the limitations of observation. The signal can be heard, recorded, and analyzed, but without context, it cannot be fully understood. This creates a situation where the information is available, but the meaning is not. It is a reminder that data alone is not enough to produce understanding, and that interpretation depends on knowledge that may not always be accessible. The UVB-76 signal continues to broadcast today, maintaining its pattern with only occasional changes. The buzzing remains, the voice messages still appear, and the mystery remains unresolved. It is one of the few cases where the phenomenon is ongoing, allowing for continued observation and study. Yet despite this advantage, the core questions have not been answered. Because in the end, the challenge is not just to detect the signal, but to understand it. And when a signal exists without a clear source, without a confirmed purpose, and without a way to decode its messages, it becomes more than just a technical anomaly. It becomes a question about what lies beyond our current understanding, and about how much of the systems around us operate without our awareness. The broadcast continues, unchanged in its fundamental nature, repeating the same pattern across years and decades. And as long as it continues, it serves as a reminder that not all communication is meant to be understood by everyone, and that some signals, no matter how clearly they are received, may remain unanswered for as long as they exist. The book that no one has ever been able to read. In the early 15th century, a manuscript was created that would go on to become one of the most puzzling documents in human history. It is known today as the Voynich manuscript, a book filled with text, illustrations, and symbols that have resisted every attempt at interpretation for over 600 years. Unlike most historical texts, which can be translated, analyzed, and placed within a cultural or linguistic context, this manuscript exists in a category of its own. It is complete, detailed, and clearly intentional, yet its meaning remains entirely unknown. The manuscript is written in an unknown script, often referred to as Voynich, a language or code that does not match any known writing system. The text flows across the pages in a consistent style, with repeating patterns and structures that suggest it follows grammatical rules. This is not random writing or meaningless symbols. It has the appearance of a real language, one that was developed and used with purpose. However, despite extensive analysis, no one has been able to identify the underlying structure or translate even a single sentence with certainty. The illustrations within the manuscript add another layer of complexity. They depict plants, diagrams, and human figures, but none of them correspond clearly to known categories. The plants appear detailed with roots, stems, and leaves, but they do not match any species that can be identified with confidence. Some seem to combine features from multiple real plants, while others appear entirely fictional. This has led to speculation that the manuscript may describe something that does not exist in the natural world, or that it represents a symbolic system rather than a literal one. There are also sections of the manuscript that include circular diagrams often interpreted as astronomical or cosmological in nature. These diagrams contain symbols arranged in patterns that resemble star charts or maps, but again, they do not align with known systems. The presence of these diagrams suggests that the manuscript may have been intended to convey complex information, possibly related to science, medicine, or philosophy. Yet without a way to read the text, these interpretations remain speculative. One of the most unusual sections of the manuscript includes illustrations of human figures, often depicted in what appear to be pools or containers filled with a greenish liquid. These figures are sometimes connected by tubes or channels, creating scenes that are difficult to interpret. Some researchers have suggested that these images could represent medical procedures, biological processes, or symbolic concepts related to the human body. Others believe they may have a more abstract meaning, possibly connected to alchemy or spiritual practices. The manuscript was named after Wilfrid Voynich, a rare book dealer who acquired it in 1912. Since then, it has been studied by some of the most skilled cryptographers, linguists, and historians in the world. During both World Wars, experts who had worked on breaking complex codes turned their attention to the manuscript, hoping to apply their skills to this long-standing mystery. Despite their efforts, no definitive breakthrough was achieved. The text remained undeciphered, and the manuscript continued to resist interpretation. One of the central questions surrounding the Voynich manuscript is whether it represents a real language or a code. If it is a language, then it must follow rules of grammar, syntax, and vocabulary that can be identified through analysis. If it is a code, then it must have an underlying system that can be decoded using the correct key. In both cases, the assumption is that the text has meaning, and that meaning can be uncovered with the right approach. However, the failure to make progress in either direction has led some to question whether these assumptions are correct. There is a theory that the manuscript could be an elaborate hoax, created to appear meaningful while containing no actual information. According to this idea, the author may have intentionally designed the text to mimic the structure of a real language, using patterns and repetition to create the illusion of meaning. If this is the case, then the manuscript would not be intended to be read, but rather to be observed, perhaps as a demonstration of skill, or as a form of deception. However, this theory faces challenges, particularly in explaining the level of detail and consistency found throughout the document. Another possibility is that the manuscript represents a lost or constructed language, one that was used within a specific group or for a specific purpose. If the language was not widely used or documented, It could have disappeared without leaving any traces that would allow for comparison. This would make it extremely difficult to translate, as there would be no reference points or related texts to use as a guide. In this scenario, the manuscript would be a unique record of a system that no longer exists. There are also theories that place the manuscript within the context of historical practices such as alchemy or early scientific experimentation. During the time it was created, the boundaries between science, mysticism, and philosophy were not clearly defined. It is possible that the manuscript was intended to record knowledge that was considered secret or restricted, using a coded or symbolic language to protect it from those who were not meant to understand it. If this is the case, then the difficulty in decoding it may be a reflection of its original purpose. Modern technology has provided new tools for analyzing the manuscript. Techniques such as spectral imaging have been used to examine the ink and materials, confirming that the document is authentic and dates back to the early 15th century. Computational analysis has been applied to the text, identifying patterns and frequencies that suggest it is not random. These findings support the idea that the manuscript contains structured information, but they do not reveal what that information is. The persistence of the mystery is partly due to the balance between evidence and interpretation. There is enough evidence to show that the manuscript is intentional and structured, but not enough to determine its meaning. This creates a situation where multiple theories can exist simultaneously, each addressing certain aspects of the document, but none providing a complete explanation. The Voynich manuscript is currently housed in a library, where it continues to be studied and preserved. It is accessible to researchers, and its images have been made available for public examination. Despite this level of access, the core challenge remains unchanged. The text cannot be read, the illustrations cannot be fully interpreted, and the purpose of the manuscript remains unclear. What makes this case particularly significant is not just the mystery itself, but what it represents. It challenges the assumption that all written information can eventually be understood, given enough time and effort. It suggests that there may be limits to interpretation, that some systems of communication may not be accessible without specific knowledge that has been lost. It also raises questions about the nature of knowledge and how it is preserved. If the manuscript does contain meaningful information, then that information has been effectively hidden for centuries, not through physical barriers, but through the absence of a key. This highlights the importance of context in understanding any form of communication. Without context, even the most detailed and carefully constructed text can become inaccessible. The Voynich manuscript remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the study of language and cryptography. It continues to attract attention, inspire research, and generate new theories. Yet despite all of this, it has not yielded its secrets. It stands as a reminder that even in a world where information is constantly being decoded and understood, there are still cases where the meaning remains out of reach. Because sometimes the challenge is not finding the information, but knowing how to interpret it. And when the method of interpretation is unknown, the information itself becomes a mystery, one that can be observed, analyzed, and discussed, but not fully understood. The lights that appear, follow, and disappear without a trace. For generations, across different countries, cultures, and time periods, there have been reports of strange lights appearing in remote areas, often at night, often in silence, and almost always without a clear explanation. These lights are not like stars, not like aircraft, and not like anything that can be easily identified. They move in ways that do not match known technology, appear in places where no infrastructure exists, and behave in patterns that suggest intention without ever revealing a source. Among the most well-known of these phenomena are the Marfa lights in Texas, but similar sightings have been reported in Australia, Norway, Japan, and many other locations. Despite decades of observation, investigation, and analysis, these lights remain one of the most persistent and unexplained mysteries in modern history. The Marfa lights were first widely reported in the late 19th century, though some accounts suggest they may have been seen even earlier. They appear in the desert near the town of Marfa, Texas, often described as glowing orbs that hover above the horizon. Witnesses report that the lights can change color, split into multiple points, merge back together, and move in directions that do not follow any predictable pattern. Sometimes they remain stationary, flickering in place, and other times they travel rapidly across the landscape, only to disappear suddenly without leaving any trace. What makes these sightings particularly compelling is their consistency. Over the years, thousands of people have reported seeing the lights, including locals, travelers, scientists, and researchers. The descriptions are often similar, even when the witnesses have no connection to each other. This consistency suggests that the phenomenon is not purely subjective or imagined. There is something being observed, something that exists in the physical environment, even if its nature is not fully understood. Attempts to explain the lights have produced a range of theories, each addressing certain aspects of the phenomenon while leaving others unresolved. One of the earliest explanations was that the lights were caused by natural gas emissions. According to this idea, gases released from the ground could ignite under certain conditions, producing glowing orbs that appear and disappear. While this explanation is plausible in some contexts, it does not fully account for the behavior of the lights, particularly their movement and ability to change direction. Another theory suggests that the lights are a form of atmospheric reflection, caused by distant headlights or other sources of illumination being refracted through layers of air with varying temperatures. This phenomenon, known as a temperature inversion, can create visual distortions that make lights appear to hover or move in unusual ways. In some cases, this explanation has been supported by experiments that successfully reproduced similar effects under controlled conditions. However, it does not explain all sightings, especially those that occur in areas where no external light sources are present. There is also the possibility that the lights are related to electrical or geological activity. Some researchers have proposed that stress within the Earth's crust can generate electrical charges, which may be released in the form of visible light. This concept, sometimes referred to as earthquake lights, has been observed in certain conditions, though it is not fully understood. If this explanation applies to the Marfa lights and similar phenomena, it would suggest a natural origin, but one that operates under conditions that are not yet fully documented. Despite these scientific theories, there are still aspects of the lights that remain difficult to explain. One of the most unusual features reported by witnesses is the way the lights seem to respond to observation. In some cases, people have claimed that the lights appear to follow them, maintaining a distance or changing direction in response to movement. While these accounts are not consistent across all sightings, they introduce the possibility that the phenomenon may involve factors that are not purely physical. There are also reports of the lights behaving in coordinated ways, moving together in patterns that resemble communication or interaction. In some instances, multiple lights have been seen converging, separating, and rejoining in sequences that appear deliberate. While these patterns could be coincidental or the result of natural processes, they contribute to the perception that the lights are not entirely random. The persistence of the phenomenon has led to continued observation and study. In Marfa, a designated viewing area has been established, allowing people to watch for the lights under controlled conditions. Researchers have set up equipment to record and analyze the sightings, using cameras, sensors, and other tools to gather data. These efforts have confirmed the presence of unexplained light sources, but they have not provided a definitive explanation for their origin or behavior. Similar phenomena have been reported in other parts of the world, often with comparable characteristics. In Norway, the Hesteland lights have been observed for decades, displaying similar patterns of movement and variation in color. In Australia, the Min lights have been described as following travelers across long distances, maintaining visibility even as people attempt to approach or avoid them. These global parallels suggest that the phenomenon is not limited to a single location, but may be part of a broader category of unexplained natural or environmental events. One of the challenges in studying these lights is their unpredictability. They do not appear on a fixed schedule, and their behavior can vary from one sighting to another. This makes it difficult to gather consistent data or to conduct experiments under controlled conditions. Without the ability to reproduce the phenomenon reliably, researchers are limited to observation and analysis of recorded events, which may not capture all relevant factors. The question of whether the lights have a single explanation or multiple causes remains open. It is possible that different sightings, even those that appear similar, may be the result of different processes. Some may be explained by atmospheric conditions, others by geological activity, and still others by factors that have not yet been identified. This complexity makes it difficult to develop a unified theory that accounts for all reported cases. There are also more speculative interpretations, though they are not supported by scientific evidence. Some have suggested that the lights could be related to unknown technologies or even to phenomena that fall outside current scientific understanding. While these ideas are often dismissed, they persist because of the gaps in existing explanations. When conventional theories cannot fully account for observed behavior, alternative possibilities tend to emerge. What makes the mystery of these lights particularly enduring is the combination of visibility and uncertainty. Unlike many unexplained phenomena that are based on limited or indirect evidence, these lights can be seen directly. They are observable, recordable, and, in some cases, repeatable. Yet despite this accessibility, their nature remains unclear. This creates a situation where the phenomenon is both present and unexplained, a rare combination that continues to attract attention. The lights do not leave physical traces that can be easily analyzed. There are no materials to examine, no residues to test, and no structures to investigate. The evidence consists primarily of visual observation and recorded data, which, while valuable, does not provide the same level of detail as physical samples. This limitation contributes to the difficulty in identifying the underlying cause. Over time, the study of these lights has become an interdisciplinary effort involving physics, geology, atmospheric science, and even psychology. Each field offers a different perspective, and each contributes to a broader understanding of the phenomenon. However, the integration of these perspectives has not yet produced a definitive answer. Instead, it has highlighted the complexity of the problem and the need for further research. The Marfa lights and similar phenomena continue to be observed today, maintaining their presence in both scientific study and public interest. They are part of a category of mysteries that exist at the edge of current understanding, where known principles provide partial explanations but not complete ones. This position between explanation and uncertainty is what allows the mystery to persist, because when something can be seen, recorded, and studied, yet still cannot be fully explained, it challenges the assumption that observation alone is enough to produce understanding. It suggests that there are aspects of the natural world that operate under conditions we do not yet fully grasp, and that even with advanced tools and methods, some phenomena may remain unresolved. The lights appear, move, and disappear, repeating a pattern that has been observed for generations. And as long as they continue to do so, they remain a reminder that not everything we encounter can be easily categorized or explained, and that sometimes the most visible mysteries are also the most difficult to understand. The flight that landed without a single passenger in 1955, a commercial aircraft known as Flight 914, reportedly departed from New York, heading toward Miami, carrying dozens of passengers and crew members on what should have been a routine journey. The weather was clear, the aircraft was functioning normally, and there were no signs of trouble before takeoff. Everything about the flight appeared ordinary, and there was no reason to expect that anything unusual would occur. But somewhere along its route, the aircraft disappeared from radar, without sending any distress signal, without reporting any malfunction, and without leaving behind any trace of what had happened. At the time, such disappearances, while rare, were not completely unheard of. Investigations were launched, search operations were conducted, and efforts were made to locate any evidence of the aircraft's fate. However, no wreckage was found, no debris was recovered, and no confirmed sightings were reported. The flight was eventually classified as missing, and over time, it became one of the many unresolved cases in aviation history. Without evidence, the investigation reached a point where no further progress could be made, and the story began to fade from immediate attention. Decades later, a new development was reported, one that would transform the case from a missing flight into something far more difficult to explain. According to these reports, an aircraft matching the description of Flight 914 appeared unexpectedly in the airspace over Caracas, Venezuela. Air traffic controllers observed the plane on radar, but its presence did not match any scheduled flights, and its identification did not correspond to any known aircraft in operation at that time. When communication was established, the pilot appeared confused, asking for confirmation of his location and the current date. The response from the control tower introduced a contradiction that could not be easily resolved. The pilot was informed that he was in Caracas, and that the year was no longer 1955. According to the reports, the pilot reacted with disbelief, insisting that his flight had departed only hours earlier. The situation escalated quickly as both the pilot and the controllers attempted to reconcile the difference between their respective timelines. The aircraft, which should have been missing for decades, appeared to be operating as if no time had passed. When the plane was directed to land, observers reported that it matched the design and markings of an aircraft from the 1950s, not one that would be expected in the air decades later. The landing was completed without incident, and the aircraft came to a stop on the runway. However, before a full inspection could be conducted, the situation took another unexpected turn. The pilot reportedly refused to allow the aircraft to be approached, and after a brief exchange, the plane took off again, disappearing from the airspace in a manner similar to its original disappearance. The details of this event have been widely debated, with some accounts providing specific descriptions of the aircraft, the communication, and the sequence of events, while others question the accuracy or authenticity of the reports. The lack of official documentation and the reliance on secondary sources make it difficult to confirm the exact nature of what occurred. However, the consistency of the core elements of the story has led to continued interest and speculation. One of the primary explanations offered for this case is that it is a fabrication or a misinterpretation of unrelated events. According to this view, the story may have originated from a combination of aviation incidents, misunderstandings, and later embellishments. Over time, these elements could have been combined into a single narrative that appears coherent, but is not based on a single verified event. This explanation addresses the lack of official records and the inconsistencies in the details, but it does not fully explain why the story has persisted or why it continues to be discussed. Another possibility is that the event, if it occurred, was the result of a navigational error combined with unusual atmospheric conditions. In this scenario, the aircraft may have been displaced in a way that caused confusion about its location and timing. However, this explanation struggles to account for the reported time discrepancy, which is central to the mystery. Navigational errors can explain changes in position, but they do not explain the perception of time passing differently for those involved. There are also theories that involve more complex interpretations of time and space. Some suggest that the aircraft may have encountered a phenomenon that affected its passage through time, causing it to reappear in a different era. These ideas are often associated with concepts such as time distortion or temporal displacement, which, while explored in theoretical physics, have not been observed in a way that would support this type of event. These explanations are speculative and not supported by empirical evidence, but they persist because they offer a way to reconcile the reported details. The behavior of the pilot, as described in some accounts, adds another layer of complexity. His confusion about the date and location suggests that, from his perspective, the flight had not experienced any interruption. This raises questions about perception and continuity. If the event were real, it would imply that the passage of time was not consistent for all parties involved, a concept that challenges conventional understanding. The disappearance and reappearance of the aircraft also raise questions about detection and tracking. Modern air traffic control systems are designed to monitor and record aircraft movements, and while technology in the 1950s was less advanced, it was still capable of tracking flights within certain parameters. The absence of records confirming either the original disappearance or the later reappearance suggests that if the event occurred, it did so outside the range of standard detection, or that the records have not been preserved or made available. The case also highlights the role of documentation in establishing the validity of an event. Without official records, physical evidence, or consistent eyewitness accounts, it becomes difficult to separate fact from interpretation. This does not necessarily mean that the event did not occur, but it does limit the ability to confirm it. In the absence of verifiable data, the story exists in a space where it can be considered, analyzed, and debated, but not definitively proven. Despite these challenges, the story of Flight 914 continues to be referenced as an example of an unexplained aviation mystery. It is often included in discussions of unusual phenomena, particularly those involving time and perception. The combination of a missing aircraft, a reported reappearance, and a discrepancy in time creates a narrative that is difficult to ignore, even if it cannot be fully validated. What makes this case particularly compelling is the way it intersects with broader questions about reality and understanding. Aviation is a field that relies heavily on precision, documentation, and consistency. When an event is reported that contradicts these principles, it challenges the assumptions that underlie the system. It suggests that there may be factors that are not fully accounted for, or that the available information is incomplete. The persistence of the story also reflects the way in which certain types of mysteries capture attention. Events that involve disappearance, reappearance, and contradictions in time tend to resonate because they challenge fundamental concepts. They raise questions not just about what happened, but about how we understand events and how we interpret evidence. In examining this case, it is important to consider both the limitations of the available information and the nature of the claims being made. Without verifiable data, the story cannot be confirmed in a conventional sense. At the same time, the consistency of the narrative and its continued presence in discussions of unexplained phenomena suggests that it fulfills a role beyond simple documentation. It represents a type of mystery that exists at the boundary of what can be explained and what cannot. The idea of a flight disappearing and then reappearing decades later, unchanged and unaware of the passage of time, is difficult to reconcile with current understanding. It requires either a reinterpretation of the events or an expansion of the framework used to explain them. In either case, the result is the same. The story remains unresolved, not because it has been ignored, but because it does not fit neatly into existing categories, and that is where the mystery continues. Not in the details that can be debated or analyzed, but in the gap between what is reported and what can be confirmed. Because when an event challenges both evidence and explanation, it does not simply disappear. It remains, waiting for a perspective that can bring the two into alignment, or for new information that can shift the balance between certainty and uncertainty. The experiment that made people hear voices that weren't there. In the 1970s, a group of researchers in Canada set out to test a simple but unsettling idea. What if it were possible to create a ghost, not by summoning anything supernatural, but by using the human mind itself? The experiment would later become known as the Philip experiment, and while it did not begin with the intention of proving anything paranormal, it ended up producing results that challenged the boundary between imagination and reality in ways that are still debated today. The experiment was conducted by a small team led by Dr. A.R.G. Owen, who was interested in exploring the psychological aspects of paranormal experiences. Instead of searching for a real ghost, the team decided to create one. They invented a fictional character named Philip Aylesford, complete with a detailed backstory. Philip was described as a 17th-century English nobleman who had lived a dramatic life, including a troubled marriage and a secret relationship that ended in tragedy. None of this was based on historical fact. It was entirely fabricated, designed to be convincing enough to feel real to those involved in the experiment. The idea was simple. If a group of people focused their attention on this fictional character, treating him as if he were real, could they generate experiences that would normally be attributed to a ghost? To test this, a group of participants gathered regularly in a controlled environment, sitting around a table in a dimly lit room. They discussed Philip, visualized him, and attempted to contact him using methods similar to those used in seances. They asked questions, waited for responses, and looked for any signs of interaction. At first, nothing happened. The sessions were uneventful, and the participants began to question whether the experiment would produce any results at all. But over time, something changed. Subtle noises began to occur, faint taps and knocks that seemed to respond to questions. At first, these sounds were inconsistent, easy to dismiss as random or coincidental. But as the sessions continued, the responses became more structured. The participants would ask a question, and a series of knocks would follow, as if something was answering. The group developed a system to interpret these responses. A single knock might indicate yes, while two knocks could mean no. Using this method, they began to have what appeared to be conversations with Philip. The responses were not always immediate, and they were not always clear, but they were consistent enough to suggest a pattern. The participants reported feeling as though they were interacting with something that had awareness, something that could respond to their presence. As the experiment progressed, the phenomena became more pronounced. The table around which the group sat began to move slightly, shifting in response to questions or changes in the atmosphere of the room. On some occasions, the table would tilt or vibrate, movements that were difficult to attribute to any one individual. The participants were aware of the possibility of unconscious movement, but the consistency and timing of the responses made it difficult to dismiss entirely. One of the most unusual aspects of the experiment was the personality that seemed to emerge through the responses. Philip, the fictional character, appeared to develop traits that aligned with the story created for him. The responses suggested a sense of humor, preferences, and even emotions. When asked questions related to his backstory, the responses were consistent with the narrative the group had constructed. This raised a critical question. Were the participants influencing the responses through their expectations, or was something else occurring? The researchers considered several explanations for what they were observing. One of the primary theories was that the phenomena were the result of the ideomotor effect, a psychological process in which individuals make movements unconsciously, without being aware of it. This effect is often associated with tools like Ouija boards, where participants believe they are not controlling the movement, even though their own actions are responsible. In the context of the Philip experiment, this could explain the table movements and the timing of the knocks. However, the ideomotor effect does not fully account for all aspects of the experiment. While it can explain physical movements, it does not easily explain the structured nature of the responses or the way in which they appeared to align with the narrative of the fictional character. The participants were not consciously directing the responses, and in many cases they were surprised by the outcomes. This suggests that the process may involve more complex interactions between expectation, perception, and unconscious behavior. Another explanation focuses on the role of group dynamics. The participants were working together, sharing a common goal and a shared belief in the process. In such environments, it is possible for individuals to influence each other in subtle ways, reinforcing certain patterns of behavior and interpretation. Over time, this can create a feedback loop, where expectations shape experiences, and experiences reinforce expectations. This could explain how the responses became more structured and consistent as the experiment continued. There is also the possibility that the experiment demonstrates the power of suggestion. By focusing on a single idea, repeatedly visualizing it, and treating it as real, the participants may have altered their perception in a way that allowed them to experience events that felt external, even if they originated internally. This does not mean that the experiences were imagined in a simple sense, but rather that they were constructed through a complex interaction of cognitive processes. Despite these explanations, the results of the experiment remain unusual. The consistency of the responses, the development of a distinct personality, and the physical movements observed all contribute to a scenario that is difficult to reduce to a single cause. The experiment does not provide evidence of a real ghost, but it does demonstrate that under certain conditions, people can produce experiences that closely resemble paranormal activity. The implications of this are significant. If a group of individuals can create such experiences without any external entity, it raises questions about other reported phenomena. It suggests that some experiences attributed to external forces may in fact be generated through internal processes that are not fully understood. This does not invalidate all such reports, but it does introduce an additional layer of complexity in interpreting them. The Philip experiment was later repeated with variations, including different fictional characters and different groups of participants. In some cases, similar results were observed, while in others, the phenomena were less pronounced or did not occur at all. This variability suggests that the outcome may depend on specific conditions, such as the level of engagement, the dynamics of the group, and the expectations of the participants. What makes this case particularly compelling is that it does not rely on external mystery. There is no unknown location, no missing evidence, and no unexplained object. The entire experiment takes place within a controlled environment, with participants who are aware of the conditions and the purpose. Yet, despite this level of control, the results challenge the assumption that such phenomena require an external cause. It also raises questions about the nature of perception in reality. If experiences can be generated in this way, then the distinction between internal and external becomes less clear. What feels real may not always originate from an external source, and what appears to be an independent response may be influenced by factors that are not immediately visible. The Philip experiment does not provide definitive answers, but it does offer a different perspective on how certain experiences can occur. It suggests that the human mind is capable of producing complex, structured responses under the right conditions, and that these responses can be interpreted in ways that extend beyond their origin. Today, the experiment is often referenced in discussions about psychology, perception, and the interpretation of unexplained phenomena. It is not considered proof of the paranormal, but it is also not easily dismissed as a simple demonstration. It occupies a space where multiple explanations intersect, each addressing part of the outcome but not the whole. Because in the end, the most interesting aspect of the experiment is not whether Philip existed, but how the participants experienced him. The responses, the movements, and the interactions all felt real to those involved, regardless of their origin. And that raises a question that extends beyond this single case. If an experience feels real, if it produces consistent and observable effects, how do we determine where it comes from? That question remains open, not because it cannot be asked, but because the answer depends on factors that are not always visible. And in that space, between perception and explanation, the experiment continues to hold its place as one of the more unusual and thought-provoking investigations into the nature of human experience. The incident where time seemed to stop for an entire town, in the early 20th century, in a small European town often identified in later accounts as part of Eastern Europe, a strange and deeply unsettling event was reported by multiple residents, an event that did not involve disappearance, violence, or visible destruction, but something far more difficult to define. According to the accounts, for a brief period, time itself appeared to behave in a way that did not match normal experience. Clocks stopped, movement slowed, and for those who witnessed it, reality seemed to pause, not completely, but enough to leave a lasting impression that something fundamental had been disrupted. The incident began on what was otherwise a normal afternoon. People were going about their routines, working, walking, speaking, and interacting as they always did. There was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. Then, without warning, several individuals reported a sudden shift in their surroundings. The air felt heavy, sounds became distorted, and movement appeared to slow down. Some described it as if everything around them had been placed under pressure, not stopping entirely, but moving at a fraction of its normal speed. One of the most frequently cited details in the accounts is the behavior of clocks. Mechanical clocks, which were common at the time, appeared to stop or slow significantly during the event. In some cases, observers reported that the second hands paused completely, while in others, they continued to move but at an unusually slow rate. This detail is particularly significant because it suggests that the phenomenon was not limited to human perception, but may have affected physical systems as well. However, the reliability of these observations is difficult to confirm, as the records are based on personal accounts rather than controlled measurements. People who were outdoors at the time reported seeing others moving in what appeared to be slow motion. Conversations became difficult to follow, as voices sounded stretched or distorted. Some individuals claimed that they were able to move normally, while everything around them seemed to lag behind. Others experienced the opposite, feeling as though they themselves were slowed while the rest of the world continued at its usual pace. This variation in perception adds complexity to the event, suggesting that the experience may not have been uniform for all observers. The duration of the incident is another point of uncertainty. Most accounts suggest that it lasted only a few minutes, though for those experiencing it, the passage of time felt much longer. This discrepancy between actual duration and perceived duration is a common feature in unusual experiences, where the mind interprets time differently under certain conditions. However, in this case, the reports of physical changes, such as the behavior of clocks, introduce the possibility that the effect was not purely psychological. After the event ended, everything returned to normal. Clocks resumed their movement, sounds returned to their usual clarity, and people continued their activities. There was no visible damage, no lasting physical changes, and no immediate explanation for what had occurred. The town, which had briefly experienced something outside of ordinary understanding, returned to its routine, but the memory of the event remained. As the accounts were shared and discussed, various explanations were proposed. One of the more conventional interpretations is that the event was a form of collective psychological experience. Under certain conditions, groups of people can experience similar distortions in perception, particularly in response to stress, environmental factors, or shared expectations. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to as mass psychogenic experience, can produce consistent reports even in the absence of an external cause. However, this explanation is limited by the inclusion of physical details, such as the reported behavior of clocks, which are not easily attributed to perception alone. Another possibility involves environmental or atmospheric factors. Changes in air pressure, electromagnetic fields, or other environmental conditions could potentially affect both human perception and mechanical systems. For example, strong electromagnetic interference can disrupt electronic devices, though its effect on purely mechanical clocks is less clear. If such a factor were present, it could provide a link between the subjective experiences of the residents and the reported physical anomalies. However, there is no direct evidence to confirm that such conditions existed at the time of the event. There are also interpretations that consider the possibility of localized disturbances in time itself. In theoretical physics, time is understood as a dimension that can be affected by factors such as gravity and velocity. While these effects are typically observed at scales far beyond everyday experience, the idea of a localized distortion, though highly speculative, has been suggested as a way to explain the reported phenomena. This interpretation, however, remains within the realm of theory and does not have empirical support in the context of this event. Some researchers have approached the case from a neurological perspective, suggesting that the experience of time slowing or stopping can occur under certain conditions within the brain. In moments of extreme stress or focus, individuals may perceive time differently, with events appearing to unfold more slowly than they actually do. This could explain the subjective aspect of the reports, but it does not address the consistency of the accounts across multiple individuals or the reported physical effects. The lack of precise documentation makes it difficult to analyze the event with certainty. Most of the information comes from later retellings, interviews, and written accounts that may have been influenced by memory, interpretation, or the passage of time. This does not mean that the event did not occur, but it does limit the ability to verify specific details. Without contemporaneous records, measurements, or physical evidence, the case remains open to interpretation. What makes this incident particularly compelling is the way it challenges basic assumptions about time. Time is generally considered to be constant and uniform, something that moves forward at a steady rate, regardless of human perception. When reports suggest that time can behave differently even in a localized and temporary way, it raises questions about the nature of that assumption. Whether the event was a perceptual anomaly, an environmental effect, or something else entirely, it highlights the complexity of how time is experienced and understood. The consistency of certain elements across different accounts suggests that there was a shared experience, even if the exact nature of that experience is unclear. The descriptions of slowed movement, distorted sound, and altered perception of time appear in multiple reports, indicating that the event was not limited to a single individual. This shared aspect is one of the reasons the case continues to be discussed, as it suggests that something beyond ordinary experience may have occurred. At the same time, the differences in individual accounts introduce uncertainty. Not everyone described the event in the same way, and some details vary depending on the source. This variability is common in cases involving unusual experiences, as perception can be influenced by a range of factors, including expectation, attention, and individual interpretation. It also makes it more difficult to construct a single, coherent narrative that accounts for all aspects of the event. The town itself did not experience any long-term effects, and there are no records of similar incidents occurring in the same location afterward. This singular nature adds to the mystery, as it suggests that whatever caused the event was temporary and did not leave a lasting trace. It also means that there is no opportunity to observe the phenomenon again under similar conditions, limiting the ability to study it further. In the broader context of unexplained phenomena, this case represents a category of events that involve alterations in perception and experience, rather than physical objects or clear external causes. These cases are often more difficult to analyze, as they rely heavily on subjective reports and lack the kind of evidence that can be directly measured or tested. However, they are also important, as they provide insight into how human experience can be affected by factors that are not fully understood. The incident remains a topic of interest for those studying perception, time, and unusual experiences. It is referenced in discussions about how the brain processes time, how environmental factors can influence perception, and how groups of people can share similar experiences under certain conditions. While no definitive explanation has been reached, the case continues to be examined from multiple perspectives, each offering a different way of understanding what may have occurred. Because in the end, The most significant aspect of the event is not the specific details, but the way it challenges the assumption of consistency. It suggests that even something as fundamental as time may not always be experienced in the same way, and that under certain conditions, the relationship between perception and reality can become less stable. And when that happens, even briefly, it leaves behind questions that are difficult to answer. Questions about what was experienced, what actually occurred, and how the two relate to each other. Those questions remain, not because they have been ignored, but because they do not lead to a single, clear conclusion. Instead, they continue to exist at the edge of understanding, where observation and explanation do not fully align and where the mystery remains open. The footsteps that appeared in the snow and crossed an entire region. In February of 1855, after a night of heavy snowfall in Devon, England, people woke up expecting to see the usual quiet landscape shaped by wind and weather. Instead, they found something that did not fit any natural pattern. Across fields, rooftops, walls, and even narrow pathways, a continuous line of footprints stretched for miles. At first glance, the tracks seemed simple, almost easy to explain. But as more people began to follow them, it became clear that this was not an ordinary occurrence. The footprints did not behave like those left by any known animal, and the path they followed did not match any logical movement through the terrain. The tracks were described as small hoof-like impressions, each one measuring only a few inches in length. They appeared in a single line, as if whatever had made them walked in a perfectly straight sequence, placing one foot directly in front of the other. This detail alone was unusual, as most animals leave alternating tracks that reflect the natural movement of their bodies. These prints, however, formed a narrow, uninterrupted line that extended across multiple types of terrain without deviation. As people began to trace the path of the footprints, the scale of the event became more apparent. The tracks were not confined to a single area. They appeared across multiple towns and villages, covering distances estimated at over 100 miles. They crossed open fields, climbed over walls, passed through gardens, and even appeared on rooftops. In some cases, the footprints seemed to continue uninterrupted across obstacles that would normally stop or redirect an animal. Fences, gates, and even rivers did not appear to alter their path. One of the most unsettling aspects of the footprints was their consistency. The size, shape, and spacing of the prints remained the same across the entire distance. This suggested that they were made by a single source rather than multiple animals or individuals. The uniformity made it difficult to attribute the tracks to any known species, as natural movement tends to vary depending on terrain, speed, and environmental conditions. The discovery quickly became the subject of widespread attention. Local residents, farmers, and officials all attempted to understand what could have created such a pattern. Some followed the tracks for as long as they could, documenting their observations and comparing notes with others who had seen them in different locations. Despite these efforts, no clear origin or destination was identified. The tracks appeared to begin and end without explanation, fading in some areas and reappearing in others. One of the earliest explanations proposed was that the footprints were made by an animal, possibly one that was not commonly found in the region. However, this theory faced immediate challenges. The structure of the prints did not match any known animal, and the movement pattern did not align with how animals typically travel. Additionally, the ability of the tracks to cross obstacles without interruption suggested a form of movement that did not rely on conventional physical interaction with the environment. Another possibility considered was that the tracks were the result of human activity. It was suggested that someone could have created the footprints intentionally, perhaps as a prank or an experiment. However, the scale of the tracks made this explanation difficult to support. Covering such a large distance in a single night while maintaining consistent spacing and direction would require an extraordinary level of effort and coordination. There was also no evidence of tools or methods that could have been used to create the prints in such a uniform manner. Weather conditions were also examined as a potential factor. Some suggested that the combination of snowfall, wind, and melting could have created patterns that resembled footprints. Under certain conditions, natural processes can produce shapes that appear structured, even when they are not. However, this explanation does not fully account for the precision and continuity of the tracks, particularly their ability to maintain a consistent form across different environments. As the investigation continued, more unusual details began to emerge. In some locations, the footprints appeared to pass through narrow openings that would not allow a physical body to pass. In others, they were found on surfaces that were elevated or otherwise difficult to access. These observations added to the sense that the tracks were not produced by a typical physical process. They suggested a form of movement that did not interact with the environment in the expected way. The pattern of the footprints also raised questions about intention. The straight-line formation, the consistent spacing, and the ability to maintain direction across varied terrain all suggested a level of control. If the tracks were created by a living being, it would have to possess a mode of movement that is not observed in known species. If they were created by another process, that process would have to operate with a level of precision that is difficult to attribute to natural forces. Over time, the event became known as the Devil's Footprints, a name that reflects the interpretation of the phenomenon by some of those who witnessed it. In a period where unexplained events were often associated with supernatural explanations, the idea that the tracks could have been made by something beyond ordinary understanding was not uncommon. While this interpretation does not provide a scientific explanation, it does highlight the impact the event had on those who experienced it. In the years that followed, similar reports were made in other locations, though none matched the scale or consistency of the Devon footprints. These later cases often involved unusual tracks appearing in snow or other surfaces, but they were typically limited in scope and could often be explained by known causes. The Devon event remains unique in its combination of distance, consistency, and lack of explanation. Modern analysis of the case has focused on re-evaluating the original reports and considering how environmental factors might have contributed to the observations. Some researchers have suggested that a combination of animal tracks, altered by melting and refreezing, could have produced shapes that appeared uniform. Others have proposed that multiple independent tracks may have been perceived as a single continuous line, due to the way they were observed and reported. While these explanations provide possible mechanisms, they do not fully account for all aspects of the event. The absence of physical evidence is one of the key challenges in analyzing this case. The footprints existed only for a limited time, disappearing as the snow melted. Without photographs, samples, or direct measurements, the investigation relies entirely on written accounts and descriptions. This limits the ability to test hypotheses or verify details, making it difficult to reach a definitive conclusion. Despite these limitations, the Devon footprints continue to be discussed as one of the more unusual historical events involving unexplained physical traces. The combination of scale, consistency, and lack of a clear source places it in a category of mysteries that resist simple explanation. It is not just the appearance of the footprints that is unusual, but the way they interacted with the environment, maintaining a pattern that does not align with known behavior. The case also raises broader questions about how such events are interpreted. When a pattern is observed that does not match expectations, there is a tendency to search for explanations within familiar frameworks. If those frameworks do not provide answers, alternative interpretations emerge, ranging from natural anomalies to more speculative ideas. The Devon footprints illustrate how an event can exist at the intersection of observation and interpretation, where the available information supports multiple possibilities without confirming any of them. In examining this case, it is important to consider both the reliability of the accounts and the context in which they were recorded. The descriptions come from individuals who were observing something unfamiliar, and their interpretations may have been influenced by their expectations and the information available to them. At the same time, the consistency of certain details across different reports suggests that there was a shared experience, even if the exact nature of that experience is not fully understood. Today, the story of the Devon footprints remains part of historical and cultural discussions about unexplained phenomena. It is often referenced as an example of how physical evidence can appear without a clear cause, and how such evidence can challenge existing assumptions. While new explanations may continue to be proposed, the core mystery remains unchanged. Because in the end, the most difficult aspect of the case is not the presence of the footprints, but the absence of a clear mechanism that could have created them. The tracks were observed, described, and followed, yet their origin was never identified. And when an event leaves behind evidence without an explanation, it continues to exist as a question, one that invites analysis, but resists resolution. The phone calls that came from people who were already dead in the late 20th century, as telephone technology became a central part of everyday life, a series of incidents began to surface that challenged not the reliability of the devices, but the assumptions people had about communication itself. These were not cases of crossed wires, static interference, or mistaken numbers. They were something far more unsettling. People reported receiving phone calls from individuals who, according to official records, were already dead. These calls were not vague or unclear. In many cases, they were direct, personal, and specific enough to make it difficult to dismiss them as coincidence or error. The reports came from different locations, different times, and different people, but they shared certain similarities. A phone would ring, often at an unusual hour, and when answered, the voice on the other end would be recognized immediately. It would belong to someone the recipient knew, a relative, a friend, or an acquaintance who had passed away. The conversations varied. Some were brief, consisting of a few words or a simple message. Others were longer, involving exchanges that felt normal, almost ordinary, until the realization of who was speaking became unavoidable. One of the earliest documented cases involved a woman who reported receiving a call from her brother several days after his funeral. According to her account, the voice was unmistakable. It spoke clearly, asked about her well-being, and ended the conversation in a way that felt consistent with how her brother had spoken in life. There was no distortion, no indication that the call was anything other than real. After the call ended, she attempted to trace it, but no record of the number could be found. In another case, a man claimed to have received multiple calls from his deceased business partner. These calls occurred over a period of weeks, each one containing information related to their shared work. The details provided during the calls were accurate, including references to documents and decisions that had not been widely discussed. This level of specificity made it difficult to attribute the calls to a random source or a simple prank. If someone else had been making the calls, they would have needed access to information that was not easily available. As more reports emerged, investigators began to look for patterns and possible explanations. One of the first areas examined was the technical aspect of telephone systems. It was suggested that certain types of interference or malfunction could cause calls to be misrouted, allowing voices from other conversations to be heard unexpectedly. While this can occur under specific conditions, it does not explain how a voice could be recognized as belonging to a specific individual who was no longer alive, especially when the content of the conversation included personal details. Another possibility considered was that the calls were the result of deliberate actions by living individuals. In this scenario, someone could be imitating the voice of the deceased or using recordings to create the impression of a real conversation. Advances in technology have made voice imitation more accessible, but many of the reported cases occurred before such methods were widely available. Additionally, the emotional context of the calls, combined with the specific knowledge displayed, makes this explanation difficult to apply universally. There is also the psychological perspective, which suggests that the recipients of these calls may have been influenced by grief or emotional stress. The loss of a loved one can affect perception and memory, potentially leading individuals to interpret ordinary events in extraordinary ways. For example, a call from an unknown number or a distorted voice could be perceived as familiar under certain conditions. However, this explanation does not fully account for cases where multiple people reported similar experiences or where the content of the calls included verifiable information. Some researchers have explored the idea that these calls could be related to residual signals within communication systems. According to this theory, certain electrical or magnetic conditions might allow past signals to be replayed or accessed in unexpected ways. This concept, while intriguing, lacks empirical support and does not align with the way modern communication systems are designed to function. Signals are not stored in a way that would allow them to be retrieved spontaneously, especially not in a form that can interact dynamically with a live conversation. In examining these cases, it is important to consider the role of documentation. Many of the reports are based on personal accounts, often recorded after the event has occurred. This introduces the possibility of memory distortion or reinterpretation over time. However, some cases include additional evidence, such as call logs, recordings, or corroborating witnesses. While this evidence is not always conclusive, it adds a layer of complexity that cannot be easily dismissed. The timing of the calls is another notable factor. Many occur shortly after the death of the individual, often within days or weeks. This pattern has led some to suggest that the phenomenon, if real, may be linked to a transitional period. though this idea is not supported by scientific evidence. It does, however, reflect the way people interpret events in the context of loss and the search for meaning. There are also cultural and historical parallels to consider. Reports of communication with the deceased have existed long before the invention of telephones, appearing in various forms such as dreams, visions, and other experiences. The introduction of modern technology provides a new medium for these reports, but the underlying concept remains similar. This raises the question of whether the phenomenon is rooted in the technology itself or in the way human perception interacts with it. In some cases, attempts have been made to record or monitor these calls in real time. Investigators have set up equipment to capture incoming calls, hoping to obtain direct evidence of the phenomenon. While there have been instances where unusual recordings were obtained, none have been widely accepted as definitive proof. The lack of consistent, reproducible evidence makes it difficult to move beyond anecdotal reports. The emotional impact of these calls on the recipients is significant. For some, the experience is comforting, providing a sense of closure or continued connection. For others, it is unsettling, raising questions about what is possible and what is not. This emotional dimension is an important aspect of the phenomenon, as it influences how the events are interpreted and remembered. From a scientific perspective, the challenge lies in separating the observable elements from the interpretive ones. The ringing of the phone, the presence of a voice, and the content of the conversation are all elements that can, in theory, be analyzed. However, without consistent and verifiable data, the analysis remains limited. Each case must be considered individually, with attention to the specific details and the context in which it occurred. The possibility that these calls represent a form of communication beyond current understanding is often discussed, but it remains speculative. There is no established mechanism that would allow for such interactions, and no empirical evidence that confirms their existence. At the same time, the persistence of the report suggests that the phenomenon, whether rooted in perception, technology, or something else, is experienced in a way that feels real to those involved. The advancement of communication technology continues to introduce new variables into this discussion. As systems become more complex, the potential for unexpected interactions increases. This does not necessarily mean that the phenomenon will be explained through technological means, but it does provide additional avenues for investigation. Today, the reports of phone calls from the deceased remain part of a broader category of unexplained experiences. They are discussed in both scientific and cultural contexts, often with differing interpretations. Some view them as examples of how perception can be influenced by emotion and expectation. Others consider them as potential indicators of phenomena that are not yet fully understood. Because in the end, the question is not just whether these calls occurred, but how they are interpreted. The same set of observations can lead to different conclusions, depending on the framework used to analyze them. Without a clear and consistent explanation, the phenomenon remains open to interpretation, existing at the intersection of technology, perception, and belief. And as long as there are reports that cannot be fully explained, the mystery continues. Not as a single event with a definitive answer, but as a series of experiences that challenge the boundaries of what is considered possible. We've explored stories from different times, different places, and different realities. Vanished princes, silent ships, signals without meaning, lights that move without source, codes no one can break, voices that shouldn't exist. And yet, here we are, with more questions than answers. Because if there's one thing all of these mysteries have in common, it's not fear, it's uncertainty. Each story leaves something unfinished, a missing detail, an unexplained moment, a gap that refuses to close. And that's what makes them stay with us, not because they prove something extraordinary, but because they challenge something ordinary. They force us to question how much we actually understand about the world around us, about history, about perception, about reality itself. Think about it. How many of these cases were dismissed simply because they didn't fit existing explanations? How many answers were accepted not because they were correct, but because they were convenient? And how many mysteries are still out there, waiting, unnoticed, because we're not looking in the right way? The truth is, not every mystery is meant to be solved quickly. Some take years, some take centuries, and some may never be solved at all. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the value isn't in the answer. Maybe it's in the search, in the curiosity that keeps us asking questions, in the moments where something doesn't make sense, and instead of ignoring it, we lean in, because history isn't just made of facts, it's made of gaps, and sometimes those gaps tell the most interesting stories. So the next time you hear about something unexplained, something that doesn't quite fit, something that leaves you wondering, don't rush to dismiss it, don't force it into an answer, just sit with it, think about it, question it, because the world is far more complex than it appears. And the more we learn, the more we realize how much is still unknown. And maybe, somewhere out there, right now, another mystery is unfolding, unnoticed, unrecorded, waiting. The only question is, will we recognize it when we see it, or will it become just another story added to the list of things we almost understood? And that's where we leave it. Not with answers, but with something far more powerful, a question that stays with you long after the story ends.